to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin here with a huge week of World War III analysis. We're going to be bringing you all sorts of updates on the ongoing Third World War from the Levant, from Russia, Ukraine, from the Indo-Pacific, from Africa, as well as, of course, our weekly foray into the world of church news, everything going on in Ukraine with the persecutions there, as well as the persecution of our beloved Metropolitan Tychikos. Obviously, the big news this week is the ongoing negotiations between the United States and Iran as we near Trump's hard deadline, supposedly, to where if an agreement isn't reached in the next few days here, supposedly, fiery death will rain down upon Iran. The current discourse is, will the strike that inevitably comes, of course, those of us who understand the prophecies know that it is effectively inevitable. Will it be a Israeli solo strike, or will the United States be joining in on this strike? We're going to be discussing all of this, as well as the new negotiations in Gaza with Witkoff's new plan that has recently been rejected by Hamas. So Operation Gideon's Chariot and the hardcore genocide the Israelis are perpetrating there is likely to continue, as well as, of course, the new settlements that have been approved in the West Bank. So the genocide can move from Gaza to the West Bank on schedule, just like Miriam Adelson and the Zionists that supported the Trump regime hoped for when they gave this current administration millions and millions of dollars in the 2024 election. We're obviously also going to be discussing the huge Russian advances on the front lines in Ukraine, the latest negotiations in Istanbul, Turkey's role in sort of bridging these two conflicts in Palestine, as well as their role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict with their huge presence on the Black Sea. We're going to also be discussing Trump's tariffs, the latest from that, how China and the U.S. are facing off in the South China Sea with the revelation that over 500 U.S. troops are stationed on Taiwan itself. We're going to be discussing the huge takeover of the U.S. security apparatus by Palantir, the supposed new database that Trump is trying to set up to track and have data on every single American. Very unfortunate news to hear from there. Then moving to Africa, we're going to be discussing the escalations in Libya as this conflict appears to be moving towards a conclusion, as pretty much all of the proxies, all those supporting different groups within Libya are moving towards supporting Haftar and the Benghazi-based government. The Congo War is continuing despite the ceasefires. And of course, St. Catherine's Monastery, there's been a lot of buzz in Egypt about what is happening there with the Egyptian government persecuting the monastery. So we're going to bring you the latest on that. And of course, all of the other church news. So big week of analysis. It's good to be back here in the studio in the World War Now bunker after many weeks of travel. So it's good to be back. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing well, Conrad. Packed with all of our resources here in the bunker. We have our iodine tablets, prepared for the worst, because based on what's taking place in the Middle East at the moment, specifically in the eastern section of it, where there are some really serious discussions taking place in relation to Iran, its nuclear technology, the negotiations taking place between Israel, the US, and the Iranian officials, and essentially this split that's taking place within the Iranian government itself between these doves and hawks, which we've discussed over the last few weeks. Very interesting that the King of Saudi Arabia essentially sent his son. As we know, it's quite nepotistic, the Saudi Arabian government, as in it's very old school. The monarchy, the way it reigns and rules, is it appoints relatives of the Saud family to various positions of government. So one of the sons, and not the crown prince himself, but one of the other sons of the King of Saudi Arabia, Khalid bin Salman, he's a prince, he's the Minister of Defense of Saudi Arabia. He traveled to Iran and he met specifically with the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, not with Pezeshkian and not with Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister. So he didn't meet with the president, he didn't meet with the so-called doves, the ones who have been conducting these 5 or 6 rounds of peace talks and nuclear negotiation talks with America. It's almost like the Saudis are very concerned about what may take place in the Middle East, because they will be essentially forced to side with Israel and the US. At least this is what we in World War Now essentially posit, that there is a high likelihood that if a full-on conflict breaks out, we know who the Sunni majority Saudi Arabians will side with, and that's of course with America and Israel. And I don't think they want to shake up the status quo, because we know what happens if after a war of such a scale in the Middle East, there'll be a huge upturning. There'll be essentially regime changes taking place everywhere. Essentially a second wave of an Arab Spring, most likely in many of these countries. Many dynasties may even be toppled, given the outbreak, the ecological disaster that will take place after Israel inevitably strikes at the nuclear facilities in Iran underground and on the coast that they're building their nuclear reactors with the assistance of Russia. So it's very interesting that the supreme leader of Iran, with a very strong position, has met with the defense minister of Saudi Arabia in order to discuss some sort of peace terms, again, on this nuclear issue. But note, again, the strong point of Iran is that it really wants to continue to, at least to begin, enriching its own uranium in order to be self-sufficient in the energy sphere, in the energy sector, in order to modernize their own nation, to climb out of this economic hole that they've been in for the last 40 years in terms of, it's not quite the Cuban situation, right? Where since the Bay of Pigs time, when, of course, the US sanctioned and essentially created this barrier around Cuba, which left Cuba essentially 60 years in the past. Iran does have ties to many other BRICS-related nations and second world countries around the world with trade. So Iran is much more developed than, say, those Caribbean or like Venezuela, for example, these post-Soviet communist-related nations that are somewhat stuck in the past, but still Iran wants to push itself to the next level, especially with the rise of multipolarity. And unfortunately, the US and Israel have other plans because they see Iran as the main enemy to the greater Israel project, I think, especially being a hegemon in the Middle East alongside Saudi Arabia itself and Turkey. It's the only country out of the three Muslim majority countries which poses and has in the past, rhetorically at least, presented direct threats to Israel. And I think despite all the criticisms we have of the Iranian regime sort of giving us these strange drone attacks and missile strikes against Israel, hitting the desert, hitting certain airfields with almost no palpable results, at least on paper, according to mainstream media sources. We don't know how effective they were in reality, of course. Most likely we'll never find out. Iran is the only country, really, besides, of course, the Yemenis Houthis that have officially struck home against their enemies in the Middle East, Israel, and they've essentially disrespected that one particular country which nobody else has, even Assad's Syria, has struck sort of home against. And that's, I think, something that Netanyahu, the Likud government, the radicals within Israel, the radical Zionists are not willing to forgive them for. And this is why I think Witkoff, even despite all of Witkoff seems to be more of a dovish fellow. Like he is very effective in negotiating with these countries. Again, very strange that this East Coast, multi-millionaire, billionaire Jewish lawyer is so effective at these negotiations, but it does seem like he's trying to bring a Trump-esque type of agenda to the table, like trying to bring peace to the Middle East. As hyperbolic as that may sound today, and as cliche as that may sound, he's still trying to bring around a positive result for the Trump administration. But I think Israel has other plans. And as we'll discuss in relation to Gaza, the West Bank, Israel strikes against the west coast of Syria recently, despite all of Trump's visits to the Gulf countries, right? In recent weeks, all of those discussions about normalization between Israel and its Arab neighbors, Israel just has a different agenda. It's not interested in obeying any of its allied Gulf state Sunni Muslim allies. It's not interested in what Turkey's plans are, what Azerbaijan is planning. They're not even interested in what Russia's opinion is on Middle Eastern policy and the peace talks. I think Israel has obviously its own sovereign identity that it wishes to push and especially enforce upon its neighbors. And this is probably one of the biggest eye-opening things over the last 3 years or so, Conrad, is that we're noticing Israel turning itself into this monster hegemon in the region, as strange as it may sound on paper. Like, Israel not only commands international relations authority, it also essentially siphons financial aid, primarily from the US, but also other countries. It receives almost unequivocal support from even countries which should be opposed to it on a religious level. For example, Sunni Muslim countries, Shia countries like Azerbaijan, Turkey. And at the same time, it has this solid international support, and it has an ideology based in, again, World War II, shall we say, post-World War II propaganda, which it, again, uses as a quasi-religious excuse to justify any of its future expansion, and again, some of the crimes committed. So it'll be very interesting to see if the further rounds of discussion between Witkoff, maybe the US administration, and Iran will bring around any results, because as of this week, literally a few days ago, there were headlines all over the place that Netanyahu was going to immediately make a strike against Iran. So as we speak today, it's the 30th of May. The feast day of Ascension in the Orthodox Christian Church just took place. And unfortunately, even on such a feast day, we're somewhat browsing headlines every now and then, looking for a news story that Israel has finally flown its planes over Iraq and has struck at these key targets, which I'm sure they've been aiming at with the assistance of US drones and satellites for quite a while now. It's incredibly concerning what's taking place. It looks like the government in Israel is not going to lose this strike opportunity that 2025 has. Trump's victory and, of course, the fall of Syria has given it. And I don't think they're going to give that opportunity up in this first year of Trump's administration. And Trump, for all intents and purposes, for all of his sort of diplomatic victories in Russia, Ukraine, for example, and in trying to normalize with the world in terms of economic relations, the tariffs, and all these other successes, he is very soft on Israel. It's just simply that he cannot pressure Netanyahu for whatever reason. And I think we know why, because this particular lobby has such a strong hold over America, both domestically and in its foreign policy relations. And I think Witkoff, just even his backing down from the Hamas deal and even the proposal, it's very, shall we say, I don't blame Hamas for not accepting the deal, Conrad. And I think we'll discuss this in a bit, because Witkoff's proposal was unequivocally accepted right away by Israel, which only shows that Israel was the party that would gain more. And that's very unfortunate. It's, again, that dual loyalty aspect, which I think even Witkoff would have to be a victim of, just given his religious and ethnic background. It's just an inevitability at this point in diplomatic relations. That's just how these people operate.
I completely agree. I even heard rumors that Witkoff had Israelis with him when he was drafting the deal. So it was sort of a U.S.-Israeli proposal to the Palestinians in a lot of ways, which isn't exactly fair mediation. But you, of course, talk about the impending nuclear deal, Israel, their supposed impending strikes, their continual, flooding of the media space with specific stories. They're threatening, at a defensive, kinetic level. And of course, Netanyahu's rhetoric himself are, eternally trying to sabotage these negotiations. And then, of course, Trump, with his recent comments about wanting to blow up Iranian centrifuges and Iranian labs, it seems that the negotiations are they're definitely not going to, yield a deal in Trump's original time frame. So either Trump is going to be willing to, have a bit of an egg on his face and extend the negotiations, or we are going to see the supposed, for lack of a better term, the sort of reins let go of Israel and allow them to sort of do whatever they want, potentially even with United States support, which of course is what the Zionists would definitely prefer. But what Trump said in calling for an agreement, he talked about wanting a very strong document. This was on Wednesday of this week. He said, I want it very strong, where we can go in with inspectors. We can take whatever we want. We can blow up whatever we want, both nobody getting killed. We can blow up a lab, but nobody's going to be in the lab, as opposed to everybody being in the lab and blowing it up. He did not elaborate on those remarks, however, leaving it unclear whether Washington had actually pushed for such major concessions at the negotiating table. The Islamic Republic would be unlikely to accept such a deal under those terms. Ali Shamkhani, a senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, later denounced Trump's comments in a social media post, suggesting his proposal would cross Tehran's red lines. Effort to reach Tehran's nuclear plans and blow up their facilities have been a dream of previous U.S. presidents, he wrote. Iran is an independent state with a strong defense structure, a resilient people, and clear red lines. Negotiations are a means to progress and preserve national interests and honor, not submission and surrender. And of course, we've recently heard the reports of Trump supposedly telling Netanyahu to refrain from military action against Iran. We saw Ben Shapiro with his hilarious little song and dance show on his stupid channel talking about, why should Israel not strike? Why should Israel care about these negotiations? These negotiations are between the United States and Iran. Why does that concern Israel? Israel's the state most threatened by Iran. They have sovereignty. They should be able to take whatever action they want, which is, this insane little goblin. Just, he can't read the room. He has no understanding that nobody is behind this anymore. The naked, dual citizenship and dual loyalty and push for and bloodlust, frankly, against those that stand against the greater Israel project and Israel's goal of becoming a superpower in the region. And of course, ultimately rebuilding the third temple and ushering in the rule of the Antichrist. He just doesn't understand that the boomer evangelical Zionist cohort that, undergirded his sort of mimetic army in the West and in the United States, they are dying out. They are becoming less and less sort of aware and relevant and empowered. And many of them are even being convinced by their younger children and family members that, the sort of Christian Zionist dispensationalist nonsense is not the truth. But nonetheless, him and his ilk continue to push this garbage. And as you hinted at, Dimitri, of course, the latest headlines from Israeli channels that have access to Likud and the Netanyahu government are saying that an Israeli strike on Iran could occur as soon as Shavuot, which is a Jewish holiday this year, which will be happening on June 4th. And again, the Jews love doing these sorts of things, whether it be behind the scenes world Jewry doing exercises on Purim, like the Crocus City Hall attack and others, or, the Israeli government itself making sure that they do certain operations on certain holidays that, often line up with certain events in Jewish history and other operations at different times. They're very symbolic people, between their understanding of their 80-year curse and all these other things and their numerology and their Kabbalistic magic. They really love this stuff. So I don't know if that's going to happen. We've heard at this point a lot of different times that a strike has been prepared. I wouldn't be surprised if at this point strikes had been prepared and then were called off more at the last minute as discussions with the U.S. occur, because while Israel is capable of doing certain damage to Iran on its own, I think they really are holding out for, some false flag. Maybe they were hoping that the attack in D.C. would have pushed something forward. I think they're really hoping for something they can blame on the Iranians that affects the United States. So when they do strike Iran, the U.S. is sort of forced to begrudgingly enter into the war because public opinion is at least strong enough to where there would be, some resentment if they didn't do something. And of course, we know that U.S. bases in the region would be immediately targeted, and again, then the opening for a real false flag that Israel could perpetrate against us in the homeland, in the lower 48 states of the United States, then to be blamed on Iran, I think raises exponentially. So from that perspective, even if it is Israel's doing, our safety here in the homeland goes down as this moves forward, because I think many parties are interested in killing Americans for the purpose of dragging us deeper into the conflict. But this, potential Iran agreement isn't the only agreement. You already mentioned the Gaza agreement proposed by Witkoff, and this is from Drop Site News on Substack. It says a new proposal for a Gaza ceasefire spearheaded by Donald Trump's special envoy Witkoff includes a 60-day initial truce, a redeployment of some Israeli occupation forces, and an exchange of captives, including 10 living Israelis held in Gaza. It would also require the immediate delivery of humanitarian aid, including by the United Nations and the Red Crescent. Dropsite obtained a copy of the document labeled a term sheet by Witkoff. Netanyahu announced today that Israel had accepted the proposal, asserting it would allow Israel to continue its war of annihilation. We agree to accept the outline that was conveyed to us tonight, Netanyahu said. We do not believe Hamas will release the last hostage, and therefore we will continue fighting until Hamas is destroyed. We will not leave the Gaza Strip until all the hostages are in our hands. If finalized, the agreement would be personally announced by President Trump and states that Trump guarantees Israel's adherence to the ceasefire during the agreed-upon period. Witkoff would come to the region and finalize the agreement, it states, and to preside over the negotiations. Hamas confirmed it had received Witkoff's proposal and said it is responsibly studying it in a way that serves the interest of our people. And of course, this report was published a little bit earlier. And at this point, I believe Hamas has openly rejected the agreement and the deal, which isn't exactly surprising because, as you mentioned, Dimitri, the Israelis seem completely willing to agree to this and are openly saying that it will not stop their genocide and their wiping out of Hamas itself, who are obviously the ones negotiating. So it's clear that they probably were never that interested in accepting it based on the context it was given to them without even reading it. But of course, the other big news in Palestine, which, the West Bank has always been, sort of a low-grade conflict. Every week there's deaths and strikes and clashes and homes being bulldozed and whatnot, but, it usually doesn't overshadow what's going on in Gaza. But this is a big update. This is from Dave DeCamp on Anti-War. It says, Israel approves biggest West Bank settlement expansion in over 30 years. Israel has approved the establishment of 22 Jewish settlements in the Israeli-occupied West Bank as it continues its policy of the de facto annexation of the Palestinian territory. Peace Now, an Israeli settlement watchdog, said the approval marks the biggest expansion of the settlements in the West Bank in more than 30 years since the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993. The Israeli government no longer pretends otherwise. The annexation of the occupied territories and expansion of settlements is its central goal, Peace Now said in a statement. The cabinet's decision to establish 22 new settlements, the most extensive move of its kind since the Oslo Accords, under which Israel committed not to establish new settlements, will dramatically reshape the West Bank and entrench the occupation even further. The new settlements were announced by Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who said explicitly that the step would prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. All the new communities are being established with a strong, long-term strategic vision aimed at reinforcing Israeli control of the territory, preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state, and securing development reserves for settlement in the coming decades, the ministers said. Some of the settlements that were approved were already constructed as outposts without government approval, and others will be new. Settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory are considered illegal under international law. The approval came as Israeli settlers, emboldened by the government, have stepped up their attacks and intimidation tactics against Palestinians with the goal of stealing their land. Violent settlers recently forced 150 Palestinians to flee their village under the watch of the Israeli military. The Israeli military has also been engaged in a military campaign in the northern West Bank, which has destroyed refugee camps and displaced tens of thousands of Palestinians. Since October 7th, 2023, at least 938 Palestinians, including 198 children, have been killed by Israeli forces and settlers in the West Bank. So, of course, just as Gaza appears to be reaching its inevitable conclusion with the expulsion of the vast majority of the Palestinians, we're going to discuss that a little bit more when we talk about Libya later on in the show. It seems that Israel is now able to move resources into the West Bank, continue to expand there, and at the very least are getting so many Israeli civilians into the West Bank and legally recognized and protected by the Israeli military that these Saudi plans, these French plans, as Macron is calling for a Palestinian state and calling on the West to restrain Israel, as more and more European countries are sort of being forced to fall in line with this position, as it just becomes so naked, the genocide that's occurring, that the average European white person is obviously having a hard time standing for it and justifying their governments. We have Spain, ceasing all interactions and relations and trade with Israel. France, Macron now calling for recognition of Palestinian state. Trump, of course, even begrudgingly, having to restrain Netanyahu. It's clear that they are aware that there's a potential for an international coalition to recognize Palestine under the 1967 borders. So they are doing everything they can to make that simply impractical, to the point where even if it does happen, it doesn't actually happen on the ground. So, Dimitri, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the settlements, on the potential Israeli strike, on Shavat, and just generally the current state of the Greater Israel Project, which does also affect Lebanon, Syria right now, and Egypt.
Great analysis, Conrad. And, naturally we have to, as much as we dislike this particular religion and their traditions, we do have to comment on some of the patterns and recognition that we see, especially in relation to the current state of geopolitics, warfare taking place. If we recall, even prior to the creation of this podcast in October, November 2022, in April of 2022, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, so one of the greatest Russian fleets in Russia's history, the most famous Russian fleet, it's the flagman ship of the fleet itself, named Moscow. The Moscow ship was placed into a very compromising situation. It was essentially left alone, undefended, in the Black Sea coast close to Ukraine, and it was destroyed on Passover, in fact, right at the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian War. And of course, the casualties of that particular, the destruction of the Moscow flagship, are still left to question. There was claims of negligence by the captain. Why did he leave the Moscow flagship isolated? But in any case, it does look like the ship, which was named literally after the capital of the Third Rome, which is in the Talmudic tradition, Edom. And, since the time of Emperor Heraclius of the Byzantine Roman Empire, these Armillus emperors who founded these cities like Constantinople, Old Rome, and again, the Third Rome, Moscow, which are the enemies of the Talmudic tribe. And they need to, even their symbols need to be destroyed. So very interesting that took place. And of course, we recall the Crocus City Hall disaster on the eve of Purim that took place in 2024. All of these things, again, left somewhat unanswered, at least questions as to why these events take place on these dates. And now we have Israelis officially sort of noting that maybe the strike against Iran will take place on Shavuot. So what exactly is Shavuot? What is this particular Jewish feast day? Essentially, by analogy, it is the equivalent of the Ascension feast day for Orthodox Christians, or more correctly, Pentecost. Typically takes place 40 days or 50 days after Passover. So essentially it takes place after the exodus of the Jews in the Old Testament, the Hebrews, with Moses. They cross the Red Sea, and as they descend from Mount Sinai, when Moses gives them the 10 Commandments, the Jewish people acquire their law. So it's the giving of the Torah, and typically, according to, again, rabbinic tradition, there were sacrifices which were given at the temple in Jerusalem, and these sacrifices, sometimes there would be fruits sacrificed, there would also be animal sacrifice, then burnt up, like a burnt offering would be given. So it is always a feast day which depends calendar and date-wise as to when Passover will fall, and which is why it moves around. Typically, it falls on the last week of May to the 2 weeks of June. And we noticed that, in particular, it does quite often, according to the lunar calendar, fall on the first week of June. And we noticed that throughout history, in particular in the 19th and 20th century, when dates were very accurately recorded, there were many, many disasters in European history, and even in a broader history, for example, in India, when massive disasters would take place. Like, these are so-called accidents of committed simply by no one really, just, things just happen on the 4th of June, 5th of June. And here's a list brought up by one of our favorite historians and authors, Nicholas Kozlov, who we write about quite often. So essentially, there's a list of events that took place on the 4th and 5th of June. On the 4th of June, 1795, a third of Copenhagen was burnt down in Germany, essentially. All of them, 1,000 houses, many people left homeless, thousands of people left homeless. Essentially, an entire third of the city was burnt down by an accidental fire, right? The 4th of June, 1925, there was a huge explosion in North Carolina in a Glen coal mine. Again, purely an accident. 53 miners died. On the 3rd of June, 1962, a charter Boeing plane from Paris to Atlanta, Georgia, crashed. Just after it took off, 130 passengers died. On the 4th of June, 1967, a plane crash in Manchester, England, killed 72 people. On the 4th of June, 1972, in Rhodesia, a mine exploded essentially underground, killed over 424 people. This is before Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, that is. On the 4th of June, 1973, an aircraft in Paris crashed, ended up killing people. There was at least several buildings damaged as well. On the 4th of June, 1981, in India, actually the last and the worst to date crash of a train took place, killing over 800 people in the city of Bihar. On the 5th of June, 1983, this is very interesting because, again, we get to that flagship question. A Volga Don shipping company, a Soviet flagship, traveling across rivers with its best crew actually operating, hit the top of its superstructure into the lonely bridge on the Volga near the city of Ulyanovsk, on which a freight train was traveling. 176 people died. Some estimate as many as 600 people died. But as we know, with the Chernobyl disaster, which we discussed, oftentimes the USSR would cover up the true casualties. On the 4th of June, 1988, an explosion occurred in the Arzamas station at the Gorky Railway, where a Soviet freight train, crashed, killing 91 people, including 17 children. Most of these events, again, when the casualties do take place, most of the victims are burnt to death or gassed, or they die from a lack of oxygen. In this particular explosion of the train, 151 additional buildings were burnt down, thousands of people left without homes. On the 4th of June, the following year, 1989, which is incredibly coincidental, the largest railway disaster in the history of Russia and even the USSR took place. On a section between the Asha and the Ulu Telyak stations, a gas leak from a damaged pipeline exploded the moment two passenger trains were passing by, which ended up killing 575 people, leaving over 600 injured. However, the official calculation estimates that the explosion was actually much bigger than that, apparently reaching 12 kilotons of TNT, which, if you compare to Hiroshima, 16 kilotons, apparently even triggered the NORAD system in North America. The explosion was so large. And according to some sources within the USSR, especially dissidents, this particular explosion, the gas leak explosion, which blew up both of the trains, killed 1,284 people, injuring many thousands more, but killing 383 children, all of them burning to death after the explosion. And yeah, these disasters keep going. Again, June 4th, 2010, transformer vault in Bangladesh exploded, killing 117 people. And we can keep going. The list is gigantic, right? And coincidentally, and this is, again, almost as in mockery, on the 4th of June, it was established that the 4th of June should be dedicated to the International Day of Innocent Children, because this is after a UN General Assembly session established this on the 19th of August, 1982. This is the UN resolution ES7/8, because of an issue that took place after a lot of innocent Palestinian and Lebanese children were killed during an act of Israeli aggression. So the UN voted to make the 4th of June the Day of Children's Innocence. And we have these Israeli politicians knowing all of this, right? Knowing the connotations, the historical symbolism of that first week of June, all the disasters historically, and not even that long ago, really in the last 60 years that have taken place in this particular time frame. And they want to hit the nuclear factories, the nuclear facilities of Iran, which may or may not be enriching uranium, which may or may not be constructing some sort of weaponry underground, essentially killing probably hundreds of people, again, infecting and murdering possibly millions of people in Iran. Remember, this is a multi-million person country. We know what kind of an ecological disaster nuclear technology can bring when mismanaged. Again, the Chernobyl example is evidence of that. So again, it's very interesting how these people, despite all of the warnings from the international community, even members of the US Department trying to play kind and, trying to soften the blow of Israeli Zionist sort of zeal, are not achieving any of their ends. And essentially, it's almost like the world is heading like a freight train towards an inevitable disaster in this Third World War. And so we're covering all these news, and notice it's almost like the person controlling the train in this particular geopolitical situation is wearing a very small hat and is completely disregarding anything that sensible people are saying. But going back to, the Gaza-Hamas deal, right, Conrad? This particular situation, it's very evident to me, at least, that Witkoff and whichever Israelis or US officials he drafted the agreement with, that the Hamas leadership, in particular Khalil al-Hayya, the Hamas politician, he's not like a Yahya Sinwar or a Mohammed Sinwar. He's an actual Hamas sort of elected deputy. These are conditions which he would perhaps accept, but only with very strong consideration. Because again, the conditions, for example, we go down the list of conditions. The condition number 5 is very strange. It calls for tactical, temporary, or even gradual redeployment of Israeli troops. Like, it doesn't expressly state that Israel will leave the Gaza Strip. It just says, in accordance to the humanitarian situation on the ground, the Israelis will move out of the Gaza Strip, which won't be satisfying Hamas at all, because Hamas wants all of the IDF troops out of the Gaza Strip in their entirety. But I think one of the positive points, point 5 of the agreement, which I think Hamas would agree with, in fact, is a huge exchange of hostages, of dead bodies, of fighters from both sides. For example, it's the 10 remaining hostages would be exchanged for 125 Palestinian prisoners who are at the moment serving life sentences in Israeli prisons. We don't really have to comment as to what happens in Israeli prisons, torture, abuse, etc., at rates which I don't think any Muslim country in the world could sort of envy, right? Or even recreate. We know these Israelis commit things which are incredibly atrocious. And the exchange of 10 hostages will also take place alongside 1,111 interesting Gazans who were arrested after October 7th. So these are people who the IDF have charged within the Gaza Strip itself. They've sort of seen them maybe collaborating with Hamas, so that's the suspicion there. So we're looking at least 1,200 or so, 1,236 prisoners released by Israel in exchange for 10 hostages, which I think is fairly generous if you really consider Hamas. I think Hamas would absolutely agree with that. And again, the exchange of bodies will also take place. 18 bodies of IDF soldiers exchanged for 180 bodies of Gazan Palestinians who are allegedly Hamas fighters or somehow related to Hamas. So it's a huge exchange. We've seen, for example, the prisoner exchange between Russia and Ukraine. This was probably the one successful thing that the Istanbul peace talks reached. These things are viewed generally positively by all sides, but I think the main contention is the removal of Israeli troops from Palestinian territories, because they agitate the local people, they commit various atrocities, they kill the locals, they continue to escalate the fighting against Hamas. And essentially, if you're looking at demilitarizing the Gaza Strip, having IDF soldiers literally walking about, patrolling, etc., or conducting counter-terrorist operations won't be aiding in that particular respect. But I think the most egregious thing, Conrad, sort of this week, was that establishment of the proposal of establishing 22 new settlements in the West Bank, because this even goes against Trump's. You remember the map that the Trump administration released, Conrad, which had essentially what would Israel and the Holy Land look like, what would Palestine look like if Trump's plan came to fruition. And it shows essentially an independent Palestinian state with these small, already pre-existing West Bank settlements connected to mainland Israeli territory by underground tunnels, these protected sort of walled-off highways. But this entire map that Trump's administration drafted up goes out the window if Israel establishes 22 fresh settlements in the West Bank. I mean, the West Bank essentially will be like a slice of cheese with all these holes in it, with these essentially Israeli settlements, which continue to organically, like a metastatic cancer, expand across the region as they take different farmland territories. And again, the Israeli police is completely in control of these areas, and Palestinian Unfortunately, the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, doesn't really oppose them. And we know Mahmoud Abbas is very much a good guy in that relation. And the second most egregious thing, and this points towards Israel's intentions for the West Bank, which we've been talking about for quite a while, right? We've been speaking on this issue multiple times. Israel blocked a major delegation led by who? Allegedly an Israeli ally, somebody who Trump literally spoke to, the Saudi Arabia's top diplomats, including the Saudi Arabian foreign minister, alongside foreign ministers and deputy foreign ministers from the UAE, Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, Turkey. And they were all going to travel to the capital of Palestine in the West Bank and essentially speak to the Palestinian Authority, to Mahmoud Abbas, who was very much subservient to Israel's interest. So all these foreign ministers from these Arab Sunni countries would travel, speak to Mahmoud Abbas, and talk about the establishment of a sort of coherent Palestinian state, something disconnected from Hamas in its entirety. And yet Israel blocked this delegation just 3 days ago, as of the recording of this episode, from traveling to the West Bank. And just to note, Palestine in the West Bank does not have any airports. There aren't any airports in Gaza either. So all international delegations, they need first to have clearance from the Israeli state before they travel in. So just keep that in mind. And so it was absolutely Israel which blocked this Arab Sunni delegation, which essentially would probably try to demilitarize, de-escalate the situation in all of Palestine and Israel. And yet I think Israel's intentions, Conrad, are a bit more devious than that. And we can see this as well in this alleged de-escalation taking place between Israel and Syria. Israel just bombed a few armed depots in the city of Latakia, right next to the Russian Khmeimim airbase. Again, the Russians, as over the last 4 years, they haven't responded to Israeli airstrikes. There aren't any Russian victims of these air attacks. Apparently, Israel is saying that there are armed depots which belong to terrorists or somehow related to Hezbollah, and they're simply flying their planes over Lebanon, over the eastern Mediterranean, and just dropping bombs on sovereign Syrian territory. Even though, again, Syria is a country ruled by these former HTS, former al-Qaeda terrorists, but still, we just have to keep in mind Israel is acting with complete impunity, arrogance. And the same thing in southern Lebanon, which is still being bombed, already consecutively for the third week since the alleged normalization between the Lebanese government and Israel. Still, southern Lebanon is being bombed. So Israel is acting completely without any green lighting from the US or any other country, simply acting out of sheer hatred for their neighbors, for the people surrounding them. And I think this is not coming from a secular mindset. Clearly, this is Talmudic. I think it's deeply ideological, and most people, again, are driven by their religion and ideology. And I think these people are too. There's no profiteering here. This is not a capitalistic consideration. This is clearly a goal, objective-driven, ideological spirit, which is driving the Israelis to, again, continue to perpetrate military action in the Middle East. And I think we have to keep that in mind. These people cannot be dealt with. They don't really care about money, monetary gain, trade agreements, all these Sunni Arab countries. Their main consideration is just pure victory on a ground scale, control over people, control over territory. It's all about symbolism for these people. Again, as we spoke about the Shavuot dates, it's about enforcing power in a very old, very ancient way, almost like a biblical Old Testament type, a twisted Talmudic version of that. And I think this is what Israel is trying to aim for in relation to some of its neighbors, and even how it conducts itself in disrespecting, Egypt and all these other countries, blocking their delegations from traveling and normalizing. And Mahmoud Abbas, this is such a colorful, and a lot of Palestinians don't like him, but he has tried very hard to normalize with Israel, to sort of speak on behalf of all Palestinian people. And he's been shown complete disrespect by the Israeli government, which really shows that their intentions were negative and hostile from the beginning, Conrad.
No, that's exactly the case. And you, of course, mentioned the Shavuot and all the other sort of holy day, high day Jewish terror coincidences. And of course, we also hear very often about the 75, 80 year curse of the Jewish states, that they can't last any longer than that. So we need to consider with the strikes on Iran that, again, in many ways, we hear from some Israelis that they want to wrap up the situation in Gaza and Palestine to focus more directly on the Iran threat. And of course, it's been almost 80 years, of course, since has effectively been 80 years since the supposed burnt offering, the first Holocaust that in many ways the current state of Israel is based on, which they would tell you that it was the supposed death of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime. Many people know that that is very much a myth that is, starting to finally come out of fashion and, have the truth spoken about it. But in reality, I think in many ways, the actual sacrifice and murder that occurred was in many ways, the Germans and
Hmm.
those those residing in Europe with the, Soviet Union, sweeping through and sort of getting a Jewish revenge on Europe for daring to challenge world Jewry in, its ascendant 20th century. So now that 80 years has come to an end, it doesn't surprise me that, the Israelis, even on one of their holy days, are desperately trying to perpetrate another Holocaust, another burnt offering with bombs and nukes to perhaps have another metaphysical sacrificial basis for the continuation of the Zionist entity, which seems to be what they're attempting to do with Iran right now. Again, like I said, with Trump openly talking about blowing up the centrifuges, and he's saying we can do it
Hmm.
without the doctors in it or the scientists in it, or, we can do it with the scientists in it, which obviously just means surprise attack from the United States and Israel, which, again, it wouldn't surprise me if this occurred on the day that we're talking about here, although again, with the negotiations, it does seem that Trump is still desperately trying to come out as the great negotiator. But between this and the negotiations with Russia and Ukraine, a lot of his claims are, very much starting to not be realized as far as his ability to quickly resolve some of these worldwide conflicts. But of course, as you mentioned, Dimitri, the Houthis are one of the only forces that continue to strike Israel with effectively tacit United States approval, because as long as the Houthis, keep the Red Sea open and stop, disrupting that major shipping waterway, they pretty much have the approval of the United States to strike Israel with impunity. And again, they're very far away, so their missiles are almost always intercepted. But every few weeks, one of them seems to be able to touch down. And for better or for worse, it is nice to know that the Israelis, who are actively supporting and perpetrating a genocide in Palestine and in multiple other directions at this point, are at least facing some pressure from someone that is standing with their victims. But one of the other directions that they're perpetrating this genocide and expansion in, of course, we know is southern Syria as they advance into these Druze regions, but also in Lebanon. This was simply on May 26th, as reported by RN. Several Israeli bulldozers were lined up on the Lebanese border. Meanwhile, IDF infantry has crossed the border into Mais al-Jabal in southern Lebanon. So much like the Israeli Air Force is bombing Latakia on the coast of Syria, just north of Lebanon, they are also directly advancing, not just with soldiers, but with bulldozers to, in theory, as they would say, dismantle Hezbollah sites, but also probably to bulldoze homes, to occupy areas and set up the early stages, preliminary settlements, much like they're doing in the West Bank and much like they are doing in Syria. There are already advertisements for signing up for programs where you could be granted land and allowed to annex parts of Syria. So Israel is very intent on not giving up any of the land it's taken, whether it's in the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, or Syria. But the other big news from Syria, of course, has to do with what's going on in the northeast. Major clashes in the past week have still been ongoing between the SDF, the Kurdish SDF backed by the United States, and the Turkish backed SNA, which have been somewhat integrated into the centralized government in Damascus under al-Sharaa. But Erdogan has been accusing the SDF of not willing to integrate and isn't trying and stalling on deals that have been agreed with the government. And the SDF have presented their final demands for a possible agreement with the Syrian government. I have the list of all the demands right here. I'm going to read them right now. It says the SDF will hand over the area of Deir ez-Zor to the Damascus government. The SDF will hand over Raqqa to the Damascus government. The SDF will keep al-Hasaka, and the Syrian government will not pass its border regions, a red line for the SDF. Al-Hasaka is basically Syrian Kurdistan. It's like the Rojava region. It's the main region that borders Iraqi Kurdistan. It's sort of just the main province in the northeastern peninsula of Syria. If you look at the map, a very large region. So they're basically wanting a form of autonomy for this region. It goes on, the SDF will be incorporated into the defense ministry, but will remain a separate division under the ministry. The division will be headquartered in al-Hasaka. Damascus will pay the salaries of the SDF under the defense ministry. The entire Syrian-Turkish border must be controlled by the Damascus government and not the Syrian National Army, like they currently do in Tel Abyad and Ras Al-Ain. Damascus will take control over all the oil facilities in the Al Jazeera region of Deir ez-Zor. Oil facilities in al-Hasaka will remain under SDF control, but are open for negotiations. And then the day after these demands were released, This is from the Cradle here. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said on May 29th that the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces are stalling their implementation of an agreement reached with Syria's government to integrate its forces into the country's new army. Speaking to reporters on a flight from Azerbaijan, Erdogan affirmed Turkey's position, calling for the preservation of Syria's unity and territorial integrity and the necessity of implementing the agreement between the SDF and Damascus within the agreed-upon and planned timeframe. We had said before we welcomed the agreement, but we see the Syrian Democratic Forces are still continuing their stalling tactics. They must stop this, the Turkish president added, according to a statement from his office. In March, Syrian interim president Ahmad al-Sharaa's government made a deal with the SDF to integrate the Kurdish group into a state institution, including the army. However, this is yet to take place, and there are disagreements between Damascus and the SDF over the group's demand that it remain under Kurdish command and integrate into the Syrian army as a military bloc. It goes on to discuss how earlier this month, clashes broke out between the SDF and Syrian government forces near Aleppo's strategic Tishreen Dam. The dam had long been under Kurdish control before an agreement between the SDF and the government in April saw the establishment of a joint force aimed at overseeing the site as well as deployment of Damascus troops to the area. The clashes quickly came to an end and the area has since witnessed calm. The SDF is closely affiliated with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, which Ankara has been at war with for decades. The PKK recently pledged to dissolve and disarm in line with the call from its leadership, but continues to be targeted by Turkey, mainly in Iraq. Ankara has called on the PKK to hasten the disarmament process. Erdogan's call on Thursday comes as the PKK has been demanding guarantees before beginning to dissolve and disarm, namely about the release of its jailed leader Abdullah Öcalan by Turkish authorities and the implementation of political and legal reforms in Turkey. So the situation in Syria, obviously, despite the strikes on Israel, al-Sharaa al-Jilani is gaining legitimacy. Of course, the Trump visit from the United States was probably the biggest move in that direction. He, of course, has been meeting with Erdogan, with Saudi authorities, with pretty much all of the relevant forces at this point. So he seems to be in there to stay. But at this point, the region in the northeast with the Kurds is probably the biggest obstacle to total Syrian unity under this Sunni majority government here. And of course, the fact that that region is part of unrecognized Kurdistan, their real power base is in Erbil over in the Iraqi region, which the Syrians have no jurisdiction over. And of course, the United States controls these vital oil fields with the SDF. Once that is released, that will be probably the final nail in the coffin for the security of the current regime. They will have a level of security and control over the entire country that unfortunately the Assad regime hadn't seen in decades since, especially since the beginning of the Syrian civil war back in 2011. But Dimitri, of course, the other reason Turkey is very relevant is they are the site of the recent Russia-Ukraine delegations and negotiations, which of course is the biggest move in that direction. These are the biggest negotiations that have happened since the beginning of, well, at least since the original Istanbul agreements and negotiations, ironically enough. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Syria situation. And then, of course, we can pivot a bit northwest to Russia and the Black Sea.
Yeah, I think recent discussions by the multiple sides involved in Syria, including, of course, the Syrian incumbent government at the moment, really does show that this particular state is essentially a puppet at the moment, has no sovereignty whatsoever. It doesn't even control some of those Uzbek internationalist jihadi fighters who are, again, causing mischief on the western side of Syria, essentially on that east coast of the Mediterranean, posing a threat. So at the moment, Syria is very much in the hands of these various big state influential actors surrounding it and involved from overseas, such as the United States. And essentially, who will manipulate Syria the best in this particular government? And unfortunately, the Syrian people will depend on who has the most motivation in this particular area. It does look like Turkey is at the moment very much in the driver's seat in this regard. But even in relation to the Istanbul talks, it does seem like Hakan Fidan, we're not too sure, this is the foreign minister of Turkey, what his interests are in sort of pursuing this peace between Ukraine and Russia.
Okay, breaking news. This is a later recorded segment. Of course, right after we recorded, some major things have occurred. Of course, we call it getting news cucked here on the show. So apologies for that, but I'm sure those listening are wondering if we're going to talk about the huge Ukrainian attack, the drone attack that targeted bases all over Russia, including all the way out in the Far East. We're going to be discussing that, the latest negotiations and the leaked memorandums from the Ukrainian and the Russian side, as well as a few other things that have broken since we recorded the episode. Still a great episode. Everyone should keep listening. We cover some other really important stuff that is still very relevant going into this week, but we had to come in with an update here. So Dimitri, let us know what occurred in this huge drone attack, what happened, all of this going, in the midst of these Istanbul negotiations. So what happened?
Coincidentally, Conrad, just in time for the Talmudic feast day of Shavuot, the Ukrainians carried out one of the most, I would say, daring and extreme drone attacks that we've seen thus far in the war. So they've targeted military targets, that is 4 Russian airfields across essentially the entire territory of the Russian Federation. These are key airfields. At least 2 of them are confirmed to be holding the Tu-95 long-range bombers. These are heavy Soviet-era bombers, which the Russian Federation no longer produces. So there's about 40 or so bombers in existence at the moment, right? So they haven't been produced since the 1990s at least. And these bombers can, again, carry nuclear armaments. They can carry up to, I believe, 11 tons of bombs, if you can just imagine. So it's the equivalence of the American, probably not B-2s, which are very modern, but B-52s, the one stationed at Diego Garcia. So what exactly took place was that Ukraine carried out a 1.5-year-long sabotage operation where they planned and carried out logistics and eventually executed their plan just this weekend on the 1st of June, essentially just before the meeting of the Russian and Ukrainian delegations in Istanbul. The 4 air bases that were hit in particular, or at least the 2 that were successfully hit, were Irkutsk, which is located right next to the Lake Baikal, the largest freshwater lake in the world, in deep Siberia. If you can just imagine, this is where Mongolia and China are, very far from Ukraine. We're talking 4,000 kilometers, right? So unprecedented drone. I don't know if a drone can even physically fly from the Ukrainian border all the way that far east. And this is why the drones didn't fly that far. They were actually released via remote control operated doors, like out of some sort of James Bond movie. These big trucks drove up to the airfield, basically in the vicinity of the airfield, which was surprisingly undefended or, very lightly guarded by Russian troops in Irkutsk. The truck opened up via remote control. The driver, I believe, in Irkutsk was strangled. He was found strangulated. I believe the drivers were most likely either blackmailed or hired to drive these drones. Maybe they didn't even know what kind of deadly cargo they were carrying. And the Ukrainian saboteurs jumped out of the truck, and I believe most likely from the nearby forest, operated the truck to open up its doors. Its cargo was released, essentially waves and waves of these FPV drones, essentially the suicide drones, which we've become a little bit too familiar with throughout this unfortunate conflict, began to smash into the stationary and essentially defenseless Tu-95s and other planes located on the airstrip. And the surprising thing, I think the unfortunate reality was that the planes were simply undefended. There were no anti-drone EMP weaponry. There was no sort of electromagnetic defense located nearby, no GPS suppressing technology located around the airfield, and no even guards. Like there were no guards patrolling that could even shoot at these drones with AK-47s, let alone, of course, Saiga shotguns or anything that's commonly found on the front lines when drones are being destroyed by Russian infantry troops. And the Ukrainians damaged at least 3 to 4 massive planes in this particular attack, although the official claims by the Ukrainian side are that the casualties from the Russian side in terms of how many planes were hit were much higher, especially in the Irkutsk airbase. Yeah, coincidentally, just further out in Siberia, the other 2 air bases that the Ukrainians planned to hit were located in Chita, which is again very close to Mongolia and Lake Baikal. And unfortunately enough, that particular truck was stopped by Russians and it was never carried out. That operation failed. And in Amur, and Amur is literally where you find the Amur tigers. This is so far east, literally adjacent to North Korea and China and, the Sea of Japan. So the Amur operation also failed. Now, the second successful hit that the Ukrainians carried out, and all of these, by the way, took place at the same time simultaneously. So there were, imagine the Russian Federation, the largest country in the world, multiple reports from all around the country of terror saboteur strikes. And of course, this would lead to a lot of confusion, I think, which is why authority is regulated to the various sectors. And there are independent military bases acting with discretion around Russia in order to distribute authority and last-minute extreme decision-making. But the second base that was hit was located at Murmansk, which was a very important city, even built by Nicholas II, the Tsar, just before the revolution, before even the First World War took place. It was named Romanov on the Murman back in the day. It was essentially this port city located on the Arctic Sea, which would assist in providing Arctic Sea logistics from the north to St. Petersburg and Moscow, and essentially would open up Russia to entirely a new sea and a new port, which was very important. And of course, there was a railway built during the Soviet times, so it started during World War I, but completed during Soviet times, from Murmansk to St. Petersburg and connecting it to Moscow thereafter, which would again help with shipments. This is the same city that was, of course, that assisted Russia during the Lend-Lease program, when the British would send all kinds of aircraft and tanks to help the Soviet Union fight against the Third Reich during the Second World War, which is why Murmansk was attacked by German airplanes and the Air Force Luftwaffe during the Second World War as well. A very key city, right, located just in the Russian north, still very far from Ukraine, but it's not technically in Siberia. And Murmansk was also hit. The airfield was targeted in the same fashion, and the exact destruction rate of the aircraft at Murmansk is not definitively known. Again, the Ukrainians claim that across the two airfields, at least 40 aircrafts were damaged or destroyed, which is an insane number, including Sukhoi fighter jet planes, as well as Tu-95, these long-range bombers, which are huge planes. Again, these heavyweight carriers, the military versions of the Ilyushin planes. Again, Russia does not have currently the factories or the technology to reconstruct them. So they haven't been made for 30 to 40 years. Basically, irreparable damage has been done to the Russian Air Force. And this is, if anything, an embarrassment. Some people compare it to Pearl Harbor. I think that's slightly inappropriate. This attack was more akin to maybe Tsushima, the fleet battle between the Russian Empire and the fleet of Japan during the Russo-Japanese War. And, because it can't really be compared to Pearl Harbor, because Pearl Harbor took place as the first initiation battle for the Americans at the beginning of the Second World War. And we're already 3 years into this conflict. Russians who should expect the Ukrainians to carry out these strikes. An interesting point of analysis, Conrad, was that essentially the Americans knew exactly where these air bases were located, and perhaps even the quantity of aircraft located on them, because until 2023, both Russia and the US were members of a particular nuclear treaty, which essentially, in order to secure nuclear peace between the two superpowers, would grant either power authority to view these particular air bases from the sky via satellite, and to guarantee that these long-range, for the Americans, it would be the B-52 bombers. For the Russians, the Tu-95 bombers would be located visibly standing there on the airstrip to signify that neither country is sending them at one another to, essentially to enforce nuclear Armageddon. And so, of course, the US until 2023 clearly knew where these bombers were located. Now, the Ukraine SBU, which conducted this operation, claims success. Zelensky apparently had full oversight, and the news agency Axios has openly stated that America had foresight of this event taking place, which is unfortunately extremely serious, because Marco Rubio ended up calling Lavrov shortly, maybe a few hours after the event, and he apologized to Lavrov about the tensions that this may have caused and all of this other rhetorical garbage, which, again, I think most likely America did know. In fact, the deep state, I think the military-industrial complex in the US, probably even informed Ukrainian intelligence about where exactly the airstrips were, if they were, important targets, if it was worth even hitting them, creating this 1.5-year operation. Many people have compared this exact operation to the pager operation that Israel carried out, the decade-long preparation of the bomb pagers, which the IDF, again, and Mossad carried out against Hezbollah, which was, again, probably one of the most serious events of 2024, if you remember. Probably, I think in world history, one of the biggest terroristic espionage exploits. Coincidentally, I think, just the day before these airstrips were hit, Ukraine also carried out significant strikes over major bridges in both the Bryansk and the Kursk oblasts. So these are the two oblasts here, which are located right next to the Ukrainian front lines. Now, what exactly is the impact from these particular oblasts being hit? Apparently, the Russian, and we'll find out on the next episode of World War Now, essentially more details about exactly what the long-term impact of this will be, because this is extremely fresh news. But these major bridges, including railway lines, led and assisted the Russian troops into actually pushing into the Sumskaya Oblast, which is Ukrainian territory, which the Russians are now creating a buffer zone in. This has created a huge logistical nightmare, I think, for the Russian side. And the Russians are claiming that because the trains were carrying, sometimes they were carrying civilian peoples, and the bridges were, in fact, also used for civilian purposes, as well as, of course, military purposes, transporting tanks. You can have military trucks crossing, etc. Russians are claiming that this was a terror strike because the Ukrainian saboteurs got deep into the Russian territory, planted bombs on the bridges and blew them up locally. Now, the thing is, like, during wartime, I think most likely this could be a quasi-terroristic strike, but during wartime, usually bridges and railways that lead towards the front lines of a particular, war zone are sensible targets. It's completely normal. During the Second World War, both the Nazis and the Soviets hit key railways and bridges that either side could use. This is just standard sort of warfare tactics. So again, even during the Napoleonic times, bridges would be blown up, right, by both sides, but both even Napoleon, this is during the time of gunpowder. So it's quite common, I think, to do this. It's unfortunate that the Russian Federation I think they haven't blown up a single bridge leading over the Dnieper since the beginning of the SMO, which I think is a huge military mistake, but also a lot of the railway stations leading out of Hungary, Poland, Romania, Moldova, etc., which carry Western NATO aid to Ukraine, they haven't really been struck significantly. So this is, again, the Ukrainians essentially are now doing what the Russians should have been doing 2 or 3 years ago. And I'm not excusing the fact that, again, the Ukrainians have killed innocent people. At least 7 people have confirmed to have died. I believe they are all civilians involved in some of these train crashes. And I'm not discounting the fact that the Ukrainian leadership, who are essentially led by some of these Kabbalistic Talmudic ideas, managed to synchronize both the train and bridge attack as well as the airfield attack with the feast day of Shavuot, on the Talmudic Jewish calendar. So extremely concerning news, I think, for the Russian Federation. And we'll see exactly how this impacts the long-term peace talks between the two countries.
Yeah, and I think before I go into those peace talks, which I was going to hop into, you mentioned, of course, the rails from Romania, Hungary, these other NATO countries and whatnot. In that regard, Russia is very much fighting with sort of a hand behind its back, because I guess with the exception of China and North Korea, North Korea being the one actually sending troops, with that rare exception, Russia, their interior rail, everything leading to the front line is being struck regularly by the Ukrainians with Western supplied weapons. Whereas if Russia responded in kind at all, even with minor drone attacks into these other countries, it would be a complete escalation. The United States would completely enter the conflict, and the rest of the world would, get duped into fully supporting a war against Russia, because Russia is an imperialist power attacking all these neighboring countries, when in reality it would just be pretty basic military doctrine for trying to seize control of Ukraine by itself. But you, of course, mentioned the negotiations, and everybody was offended and freaking out that Russia hadn't immediately canceled the negotiations in the aftermath of this attack. But Medinsky, he was asked, in the aftermath of the attack, what do we do? And he's like, just wait for tomorrow, just wait for tomorrow. And now I think I see why he was saying that, because Russia, in almost a tortured way at this point, with the Istanbul negotiations as the way of rolling this out, I think they've convinced themselves that they've shown the world that they are willing to take all sorts of abuse to achieve what I would consider pretty much the minimum goals that would be needed to consider the special military operation even a success at all. Because, of course, the Ukrainian demands came out. We have the results of this negotiations right now, which apparently will be the exchange of up to 12,000 soldiers, hundreds and hundreds of POWs, 12,000, the bodies of 12,000 soldiers, of course, thousands of POWs, all sorts of POWs under the age of 25, all sorts of agreements that, again, many patriots might find offensive in the aftermath of such a brazen attack that occurred within Russia itself. But the Russian agreements, again, like I said, I'm going to read some of these conditions here. It does seem that they basically, this is kind of the first real set of demands involving territory and political administration that we've seen in a comprehensive way from, the top down in Russia. And it's clear that what we had described as sort of the minimal necessities for the SMO's goals are outlined here. And the demands are that Ukraine must internationally and legally recognize the annexation of Crimea by Russia, Internationally and legally recognize the annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson as Russian territories in full, adopt complete military neutrality and not join any military blocs, downsize the Ukrainian military with limits on both personnel and weaponry, disband all nationalist military and paramilitary units, recognize and give the Russian language official status and protect the rights, liberties, and interests of the Russian population in Ukraine, outlaw all Nazi organizations, lift all restrictions on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and lift all mutual sanctions. And then for an immediate ceasefire to be achieved, they demand that Ukraine begin withdrawing its forces from Russian territory, stop mobilization efforts and begin demobilization, stop all foreign military aid, remove all third country military personnel from its country, from the territory, including volunteers and PMCs, end martial law, as well as release all politically motivated, prisoners, political prisoners, which I believe include persecuted hierarchs and church figures. It says schedule parliamentary and presidential elections no later than 100 days after the end of martial law. So this is obviously a lot of demands. This isn't, I think, anything surprising. If anything, this is clear they're trying to establish this as a baseline because we already know that they're establishing a buffer zone in, Sumska Oblast and these other places, in the northeast of the country. So if that's already happening and this has been established as the baseline, which it's clear that Ukraine likely won't agree to this, especially in the aftermath of this big strike and, the demands that they have released about prisoner exchange and immediate ceasefires and all these sorts of things, which Russia, again, doesn't seem interested in having a ceasefire right now anytime soon. And I don't think in the aftermath of this terrorist attack that is going to be what is occurring. But Dmitry, what do you think about these demands in light of what the Ukrainians are demanding, as well as, we saw the recent video of Putin looking very tired. I'm wondering, do you think he's changed his mind about any of these things since he, handed these to Medinsky?
Well, I think the pressure on Vladimir Putin, and I'm going to correctly paraphrase Father Andrei Tkachov, who recently gave a sermon, and some people were criticizing the sermon. Maybe they were saying it was too hyperbolic. He was saying that essentially all of Russians, all the Orthodox Christian Russians should be praying for Vladimir Putin because of the burden that's on him in terms of decision-making and executive authority, him being in charge of essentially the special military operation and the war, which I think is somewhat correct, exactly. And you can see it in that footage that was recently released. I think the footage was just in relation to all of the news that has come in, the death of civilians, the ongoing peace talks, the threats from outside, the constant terror acts within Russia itself. Because remember, the deputy mayor was only blown up at this point only a week ago. This constant pressure on Russia, both from within as well as from without externally. And there is always news of loss. And I think this is taking a huge burden on the president, especially, he's not a young man anymore. So things have definitely changed since the second Chechen campaign and the Russian operation in Georgia and times like that. And it does seem like during his short conversation, and there's probably a reason why he spoke to Maria Lvova-Belova, the Commissioner for Children's Rights of the Russian Federation. They released a 5-minute segment where they was chatting about Russian orphanages and foster care homes, essentially how successful they were in Russia, which I think is true. There's no reason to believe that this was made up information. But the reason I think this interview and this sort of discussion was even released by the Russian Kremlin and the official media sources was because obviously one of the main discussion points, at least from the Ukrainian side during these peace talks in Istanbul, was the so-called abduction of Ukrainian children by the Russian Federation, which I think is, I think it's quite the chutzpah for a government led by a bunch of Talmudic criminals to claim that children are being abused. If you know what I'm getting at here, just you have to listen to the Ryan Dawson episode, The Eighth Hour, to really understand the depravity of these people. So I think you can see President Putin's face is quite tired. We'll mention this more on the next episode of The Eighth Hour. We'll be mentioning this more on the next episode of World War Now as to exactly how these particular peace talks have impacted the Russian attitudes internally, domestically. And Medinsky as well looked pretty shaken up. He wasn't as cheerful as the first round of discourse talks that took place in Istanbul. In particular, I think these talks, they were way longer. The first talks, I believe, weren't even an hour long, and these were about 2.5 hours. There was also a significant delay, which was interesting, about a 2-hour delay. And I think the Ukrainian side openly stopped using Ukrainian, so they spoke to the Russians in Russian. And you can imagine the arrogance and just the hubris of the Ukrainian side, knowing that they have successfully targeted these railways and bridges, as well as the airfields in deep Siberia and all kinds of zones in Russia going into these peace talks. They're essentially thinking of themselves as some sort of victors, right, in the long term. But in fact, these are just short-term victories and, maybe temporary embarrassments for the Russian Federation. And again, their unreasonable demands from the Ukrainian side were met by equally staunch demands by Russia, which Conrad just mentioned. I think simply even asking the Ukrainians to leave cities like Zaporozhye and Kherson for Zelensky would be unthinkable. And one of the reasons would be, and even if you compare President Putin to Zelensky, the biggest difference here is that Zelensky simply is not just a comedian, but he's a literal drug addict. He's a drug-addicted criminal. In fact, this was confirmed recently, I believe about 2 weeks ago, in an interview of Arestovich. And Arestovich, obviously the right-hand man of Zelensky during the first year of the special military operation, now essentially he's a pariah. He essentially confirmed that Zelensky was on at least a few drugs while he was in office, even during the first year of the SMO. And you can tell even physically Zelensky, he's aged quite a bit, clearly from the stress, but he's also put on muscle, which is kind of counterintuitive. You don't really put muscle on while you're in a state of hyper stress and essentially with all the cortisol going through your body and the lack of sleep. So Zelensky must be at least on a testosterone replacement therapy or some sort of testosterone dosage of some sort. You can see he gains at least 10 to 15 pounds of muscle easily over the last 3 years, which is, I think, a little bit hard to imagine, as well as Arestovich confirms that basically Zelensky continuously does cocaine, probably amphetamines of some sort to keep him up, essentially like a form of meth, to keep his energy up, to essentially to wake him up. So this man is completely drug addicted, which is why it's understandable that today, when Erdogan called Zelensky to try and prompt him to come to the table, meet up with President Putin, meet up with President Trump, Zelensky's answer was incredibly ambiguous. He just said, we're going to have to see. So we're dealing with not a serious international relations actor, but a very dangerous, borderline criminal. This is like a drug cartel baron who has taken control of a nation and who is being taken seriously, not just by prime ministers such as Netanyahu and other prime ministers around Europe, but also presidents and literally meeting with kings, princes, and princesses. And this is the face of Ukraine right now, which is a huge embarrassment, I think, to all the Maloroshan and the Orthodox Christian people of Ukraine that they're being represented by this particular creature. And that's most likely why these particular peace talks, besides the agreement to hand over certain children when they can, by the Russian side to the Ukrainians, when they can confirm that the Ukrainian parents are well and they can confirm that, these are our children, in fact, is something that the Russians agreed to, as well as you said, Conrad, the trading and the exchange of bodies by both sides and some of the POWs being held is probably the most that we're going to get out of these early Istanbul peace talks, because unfortunately the Ukrainian side is even more unreasonable than the Russian side. As much as people may think, well, Russia's demanding too much. I mean, Ukraine is demanding to return Crimea to this day. Like, we're talking about a completely unreasonable negotiating partner. And at this point, we know for sure Zelensky's not just his drug-fueled mania is pushing this particular agenda, but also he's completely puppeteered from the outside by certain mysterious and unknown forces. And I think this story will continue to develop, and we will make sure to cover it for our dear listeners and all the extreme detail that it's provided to us.
Yeah, I'm sure that not too long after you're listening to this episode, once it's published, we will see some Russian responses. So that will all be covered, of course, next week. Stay tuned, stay subscribed. Obviously, follow us on X and Telegram. We're going to be talking about all of that. But there is some other breaking news here that I'd be remiss not to add while we are already recording. And it appears that the latest proposal that the U.S. gave to Iran, which reports say that Iran is still not going to accept this positively, that they still have more demands, but supposedly, this from our end, under the proposal, Iran would not be allowed to build any new enrichment facilities and must dismantle critical infrastructure for conversion and processing of uranium. The proposal also states that Iran would have to halt new research and development of centrifuges. Iran won't be allowed to develop domestic enrichment capabilities beyond those necessary for civilian purposes. After seeing the agreement, Iran will have to temporarily reduce its enrichment concentration to 3%. This period will be agreed upon in negotiations. So basically, it wasn't a total restriction on all domestic enrichment. But of course, immediately, and this is from the same Axios report, Axios says Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will not accept this U.S. proposal to Iran. Israel demands the complete halt to Iran's nuclear enrichment program and would not accept the reduction to a 3% concentration. So what we're hearing here is that regardless of if there's a deal or not, Israel will strike Iran's nuclear capabilities anyway. That's the long and short of that. The other thing, of course, is, and again, not that I don't think Iran is genuine in wanting to pursue civilian nuclear power, but they know that they need to maintain this domestic enrichment. So whether it be secretly in some capacity or not, they can maintain their status as a nuclear threshold state, because they know, as many people have said, that, if Nazi Germany had supposedly gotten the bomb a little bit earlier, by the time the Soviet Union and the US both had it, if Nazis had been able to, succeed in that capacity before them, then who knows if what we saw go down in Berlin in 1945 would have actually happened, right? Because again, these big bombs sort of change things, even if I am skeptical of the mutually assured destruction doctrine and how it corresponds with the technology. But it does seem that the US is willing to give Iran this, in the sense that they're very obviously not wanting to pursue war, but even the Iranians apparently, I think, are demanding more, and the Israelis clearly are not going to accept it. So that is the latest breaking news there. And again, hop back into listening to the rest of the episode. It's still some fantastic analysis, but unless you have any final words, Dimitri, we can send them people back to a few days ago.
Alexander Dugin very recently in an interview, this is quite just a few days ago now, in relation to the peace talks, he simply stated that no ceasefire will satisfy the objectives that Russia proposed at the beginning of the special military operation. That is demilitarization, denazification, and again, saving the people of the Donbass from any sort of excesses of the Ukrainian terror state. So Alexander Dugin made it very clear that Russia, in fact, needs to take all of Ukraine, and maybe besides a sliver of land on its western borders, in order to actually meet these goals. Because he said very evidently, how do you denazify socially, culturally, and sort of debanderize and remove some of these toxic cultural traits from the Ukrainian sort of biosphere? I don't know how else to say it, because Ukraine at the moment has really become like this petri dish of various ideologies and foreign infections. In fact, as you can see with the persecution of the Orthodox Church and the creation of these various internationalist cults. I mean, Ukraine is well known for the president being infected by most of these things. Again, even Orthodox Church historians call Ukraine the vanguard, the bulwark against Western heresies, historically speaking. You can see that with Uniatism, even the Baptist Protestants, again, infecting many Ukrainian communities and trying to spread their degeneracy and all these other heresies across the Ukrainian land. Ukraine is the place where they meet and they experiment on the Eastern Slavic people first. So Hakan Fidan, traveling to Kiev, meets up with Ukrainian authorities. Ukraine has already prepared this memorandum. If we recall, on the 15th of May, when the first Istanbul peace discussion took place under the Ukrainian leadership of Rustem Umerov, the defense minister, and on the Russian side with Vladimir Medinsky, both sides agreed that they will prepare a memorandum, essentially a brief, right? There's a few pages, perhaps maybe 20, 50 pages long. I'm not sure if it'll be too lengthy, with some of the points and the goals and the objectives that each side wants to achieve for these peace talks. And they will exchange these documents. And then again, this will facilitate, and they can talk over some of the points written therein at this next peace discussion. Now, it's already been announced after some of these bizarre proposals. For example, Keith Kellogg from the Trump administration, he proposed that the peace talks take place in Geneva, Switzerland. I think, obviously, Lavrov already rejected, as we mentioned last week, the proposal to hold the next round of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine in the Vatican, which was very interesting. There was offers of Qatar, Doha, again, hosting the next round. And Alexander Dugin's proposal was we should take it to New Delhi, right? The capital of India, because, well, India does seem like the most neutral ground. But again, I think they want to keep it somewhat sanitary in terms of, keeping the peace talks very clean and well manicured, which is what, the peace talks have turned out last time. It was quite a clear negotiation, which led to essentially a mutual exchange of 370 or so prisoners. I'm sure there's more prisoners that will be exchanged from either side very shortly. But all these peace talks, again, they're going to be continuing. I think most likely most of you listeners will be listening to this episode already after the peace talks have commenced on the 2nd of June. That is Monday, this coming Monday. And most likely there'll already be a summary of the peace talks being released after the dropping of this episode. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of agreements they'll come to. I doubt very much that there will be a solid approach from the Russian side, sort of agreeing to a 30 or 40-day ceasefire. I think this doesn't benefit the Russian side at all. And I agree with many analysts, including Alexander Dugin, that 30 days is simply not enough for the Russian side to make any sort of gains. And then when we discuss the Russian advancements in the Sumskaya Oblast, in Kharkivskaya Oblast, and even in Donetsk, it's very clear that Russia is gaining, tens of square kilometers every single week. Ukraine is not making any advancements anywhere in the front lines. Russia is very much in the driver's seat in this Russo-Ukrainian war. At least 2025 thus far, the last 5-6 months has been incredibly fruitful for the Russian special military operation. There's no reason why it needs to be halted, right? There's no consideration there. It's quite interesting that if we see the same people representing, I think Vladimir Medinsky definitely will be representing the Russian side this coming Monday, and we'll probably see who is representing Ukraine. I wonder if the discussion in relation to terrorism will also take place. If because the SBU chief, Kirill Budanov, recently was awarded the highest award from the state of Poland. Very coincidentally, he was awarded this medal by the Polish government after a terrorist strike has took place in the south of Russia. This is the Russian warmer regions right next to the Kerch Bridge, of course, infamously attacked by the Ukrainian truck bomb just a few years ago, which we covered. Again, Ukrainian terrorism in these southern warm regions are very popular because you have an inflow of migrants and tourists coming from the south, from Turkey, Georgia. There's all these massive highways and freeways, which simply, there's an influx of citizens from all these various countries in the Middle East that travel north through the Caucasus Mountains, and none of these vehicles can be checked. And this is why the south of Russia, in particular, just north of Chechnya, Ingushetia, Abkhazia, this is some of these areas like Rostov-on-Don, Stavropol, Pyatigorsk. This is where most of the terrorist acts take place. And because the ethnic diversity of the region kind of stops, I think, local authorities from really background checking people, there's always a movement, a huge movement, almost like a migration of peoples taking place. And let me just discuss the terror act in particular. This happened actually just a day and a half ago, as the recording of this episode. The deputy mayor, so essentially the second in charge of the entire city of Stavropol, Zaur Guritsiev, who is a SMO veteran. He's essentially a participant of what President Putin announced to be the time of heroes. If you recall, just last year, one of the best resolutions of 2024 was President Putin announced that veterans of the special military operation in Ukraine, that is Russian officers, heroes who've achieved military awards, can be then reintegrated into the Russian bureaucracy, into the Russian public service, for example, given positions of prominence, and they can rise through and essentially represent the Russian people in official positions. So Zaur Guritsiev, being essentially a veteran of Mariupol, of Avdiivka, and all these other battles against Ukraine in the last few years, it was a 34-year-old man. He was awarded the position of deputy mayor, the second in charge of the city of Stavropol. Quite a nice position. But for whatever reason, on this night, at the end of May, at nighttime, he met up with this strange Ukrainian-looking fellow, or at least he appeared in the CCTV footage. He was standing on the pedestrian walk, almost waiting for someone. It's very strange, kind of murky. Why would a deputy mayor be outside of his home, somewhere in a strange street? The Ukrainian fellow approaches him holding a bag, and then, again, the camera doesn't really show it, but the explosion essentially blows up both the young Ukrainian terrorist and the deputy mayor, Zaur. And it does come to mind, well, was the Ukrainian a suicide bomber, or was he simply carrying a bomb which was meant to pass on to the deputy mayor, and then that bomb was essentially timed to explode? Perhaps maybe it was remotely detonated by a nearby SBU Ukrainian terrorist spy. And so the young Ukrainian man, he was simply paid off by US dollars, essentially, by the Ukrainian. He was an asset. He wasn't necessarily a suicide bomber, because the Ukrainian fellow really looks kind of nonchalant as he approaches the deputy mayor with the bomb in his bag. He doesn't look shaken up at all. And if you see footage of other, for example, Islamic terrorists, even they get a little bit emotional just before they sort of blow themselves up. And some of these terrorists, they get very, very much hyped up on the idea. He looked like he wasn't expecting to, again, go down with the ship, so to speak. So again, terrorism does seem to be the signature of this entire SMO war, at least from the Ukrainian side. We haven't seen equivalents from the Russian side. Notice, Conrad, the Russians simply haven't. Suicide bombing is just not something the Russians do. Truck bombs is not something the Russians do. The Russians, yes, they missile strike, they drone strike strategic targets across Ukraine, which is, I guess we'll discuss this in a moment. Because as soon as the prisoner exchange took place, the 370 prisoner exchange took place literally on the day that we finished that previous World War Now episode 120 recording, Russia bombed Ukraine with such, it was incredible. They bombed key factories on the outskirts of the city of Kharkiv, Dnipro, Kiev. Some suburbs of Ukraine, of Kiev even, were hit. We're not sure what those particular, apparently Ukraine is saying, yes, the Russians were just bombing private apartments. They were killing private citizens and just regular civilians. I'm somewhat doubtful. I think the Russians in these air-to-ground strikes, which they were conducting, so the Russians essentially flew their planes, shot long-range missiles at key Ukrainian cities. And this in combination with drone swarms resulted in some of the most significant bombardments of any Ukrainian city in the last 3 years, which is very interesting that Russia has escalated the bombing of Ukraine to such an extent, whilst literally we're in this intermission period of peace talks with Ukraine, and Trump is so somewhat amicable to Russia. What was Trump's reaction to this huge wave of bombardment by Russia? Well, he responded very emotionally. I think he was returning from a game of golf. I don't recall the clip, Conrad, but Trump was outside. He was wearing his cap. He was wearing like a white polo or something, and he probably just got the brief that Russia began heavily bombing Ukraine. And he responds by saying, well, I thought I trusted Putin. He seemed like a rational guy. Now we're going to have to sanction Russia. And it was sort of this emotional outburst. President Trump was essentially calling Putin a traitor, essentially calling Putin a terrorist and all of these things. Not the same rhetoric that Biden, of course, used against Xi Jinping and some of the other people during his presidency. Trump was a bit more reserved. But the results of this, again, were these threats now from the Trump administration. After this bombardment on the 24th, 25th, and 26th of May last week, the US is trying to put its foot down on the accelerator to bring Russia, sort of rein the Russian Federation in, because apparently Russia cannot conduct the war in the way it seems fit, right? Obviously, Russia sees an opportunity to strike at certain Ukrainian targets. Mind you, Ukraine does conduct itself in the most vulgar fashion for these terror strikes or strikes against civilians. Russia is mostly targeting military sites across Ukraine. And so the response, I think, Conrad, is very telling. It seems that the American Trump administration and even the rhinos, the Republicans, are playing a good cop, bad cop game here in this scheme of international relations. So as we're recording this episode, Lindsey Graham, the head of the Senate, the head of the Republicans, again, a huge Russophobe, and I would say a huge Slavophobe, generally speaking. I think he's the author of a famous quote which stated that, we're going to fight the Russians until the last Ukrainian, something of that sort. I'm paraphrasing, but incredibly evil, right? Not a Christian person by any stretch, a huge Zionist as well. Lindsey Graham stated that he's going to travel to France, to Germany, I believe even to the UK to discuss a new wave of sanctions against Russia. And the question arises, what kind of sanctions can the US even bring against Russia? It's already sanctioned, 30,000 plus sanctioned, 300 billion American dollars belonging to the Russians and assets frozen in overseas bank accounts and brokerages. And this new wave of sanctions, again, it's almost comical. So what the US is going to propose, what Lindsey Graham, as the bad cop in this particular discussion, he's offering to sanction and tariff both India and China if they dare trade at all with Russia. So this is essentially a collateral sanction package onto any country that deals with Russia. And again, this will, as we saw the sanctions that Donald Trump tried to impose in April of this year, I don't think this particular plan will work, unfortunately. I don't think the US economically is in a position to break off and embargo these two major economies, billions of people, such as India and China. I think Lindsey Graham is simply putting on this bad cop outfit, and now Donald Trump is going to send him on his merry way to travel around Europe to posture against Russia, because Donald Trump wants to save face. He wants to save his appearance and appear as the peace negotiator, and send this random Senator Rhino who already hates Russia and Russia already dislikes Lindsey Graham to travel around Europe, essentially pushing anti-Russian rhetoric and threatening Russia with sanctions. I personally, Conrad, doubt very much that India and China will be sanctioned just because of the Russo-Ukrainian war. I think the US has much greater consideration, especially of the looming threat of an Iranian conflict, to keep much closer and sort of more amicable relations with China and India and keep global trade going, as they serve Israeli interests in the Middle East. So what it comes down to, I think, is that Russia very much is in the driver's seat in terms of the movements on the map. We see huge progression just to the west of Pokrovsk. Russia is close to the Dnipropetrovsk region. This is an entirely new oblast, which is doesn't technically fall under the constitutional framework that the Russians have created. But if Russians do cross into Dnipropetrovsk, they can again claim what they've claimed in Sumy, where in the Sumsk Oblast, they've said, look, we're creating a buffer zone whatever that means, against Ukrainian marauders, against Ukrainian terrorists. And they, I think, will probably do the same in Dnipropetrovsk when they cross that particular border in the next few weeks. The Russians are making decent advancements towards Kupiansk. This is in the northeastern portion of Kharkiv, and there's huge positional battles ongoing in the northern Kharkiv region, which they've been ongoing for more than a year now around Volchansk to the east and west of the city. So the Russians are pressuring the Ukrainian oblast of Kharkiv, which, in my opinion, this is probably one of the most Russian regions. If people call Donetsk and Lugansk Russian, Kharkiv is classically Russian, and all those, in fact, historically, the Belgorod Oblast and the Kharkivsky Oblast were, in fact, united. And Kharkiv and Belgorod are only, 40 miles apart, distance-wise. It's essentially sister cities. You can almost call it like a Budapest type of situation, where Pest is on one side of the Danube and Buda is on the other side. And of course, the cities historically unite, creating Budapest. It's simply that sort of situation taking place here. So the Russians are making great headway. And I think amidst all of these peace talks, Conrad, we do see a somewhat of a slowing down from Ukraine. In particular, notice last week we covered their massive drone attack, the greatest drone attack in warfare history. 1,500 plus drones released over a series of 2 days by Ukraine against Russia, many of them again being struck down by Russia. But in any case, very scary seeing these flying robots again attacking civilians, military targets, absolutely insane. And all this noise from the propellers and the explosions. Ukraine, I think, only released 20 drones, per day over the last few days leading up to the end of May here. So for whatever reason, Ukraine is really pushing the brakes. And maybe this is for the best. There was this interesting story of President Putin traveling to the Kursk Oblast, and apparently his helicopter was almost struck down. So there was an official assassination attempt of President Putin in Kursk. Now, President Putin's very brave for even traveling to Kursk in the first place. I believe this is his second visit already, and I completely believe that there would be a rogue Ukrainian drone pilot or, an F-16 pilot who would try to take out the president of Russia. I think that's absolutely a possibility. I think the Ukrainian elite, however, is very much determined to continue working with Putin to some extent. I think President Putin's rhetoric is very much unsteady in terms of what exactly he wants from Ukraine. And, one of the figures which I think Ukraine would definitely like to take out, and I'll just mention this, someone who I think the Russians know and are trying to protect from traveling to some of these vulnerable regions, is Patriarch Kirill. I think Patriarch Kirill is even maybe more of a target than President Putin is. Because if something happens to Putin and, say, Mikhail Mishustin takes over or Dmitry Medvedev, they're going to be just as hawkish. Or even, Lord forbid, for the Ukrainian sake, if a Nikolai Patrushev becomes the president of Russia, it'll get, we're going back to the Cold War, basically. We're going back to the 1960s, 70s. Well, if Patriarch Kirill, he's just never traveled to the Donbass since 2014. He's never traveled to Crimea. Patriarch Kirill is very much aware. His bodyguards, if you look at every service, there's always bodyguards in the crowd, every liturgy, because I think he's the spiritual target that the Ukrainians are going to strike. And you can check out our A for Hour episode that we've done with Father John Whiteford, where we discuss the persecution of the church and how irrational it is from any sort of perspective, from a Ukrainian patriotic standpoint to an economic standpoint, and even it makes the Ukrainian government look somewhat bad. It gives them this villainous look and flavor, which I think even people like Tucker Carlson and J.D. Vance are noticing, and they're beginning to critique. So it brings us to question as to, is this war actually about geopolitics, or is it about the spiritual state of the Eastern European Slavic people? Is it a war about destroying, of course, demoralizing people, bringing them away from this Orthodox revival, which has been taking place in these regions over the last 3 decades? I think there's a lot to think about there. But in any case, Russia's making great advancements across the front line. The peace talks will be taking place. I'm sure we'll cover it on the episode 122 of World War Now next week. So we'll have definitely some reports coming in for you guys. We'll talk about Umerov, Medinsky, exactly what they come to in terms of their agreements. But just the speculative prediction from myself, I doubt very much that there'll be a 30 or a 40-day ceasefire agreed to just in the next few weeks, because I think at the moment Russia is just making too much of a headway in terms of securing some of its constitutional territories across the line. And we're coming very close to summer, and a lot of the Russian top political analysts have discussed the looming Russian summer offensive, because the ground will be steady, the grass will grow, and again, as soon as the Russians clear out some of their minefields in the Sumska and Kursk Oblast, they can begin proper frontal assault, just like we saw in 2022. So we're kind of looking forward to Russians making advancements across the line, because just keep in mind, whenever Russia pushes forward, takes new villages and cities, this essentially saves the local people from further harassment, from further ideological genocide, essentially from a cultural genocide. And the Russians aren't bullying people. They're not preventing people from speaking Ukrainian or from appreciating Ukrainian culture. But most importantly, the Russians are not persecuting the church and not persecuting the Christians of the Ukrainian Malorussian land, which is probably the most important difference between how the two sides conduct themselves in this conflict. So, generally speaking, Russia's off to a very good start, and it's coming off on the front foot in these coming new discussions as round 2 of Istanbul will take place on Monday, 2nd of June.
Yeah, these Istanbul agreements are, again, like I said, probably the biggest development as far as diplomacy goes in this conflict ever since the initial Istanbul agreements that were sabotaged, we know, by Boris Johnson back in, early 2022, not too long after the SMO began. But of course, in my opinion, the presence of Turkey being the place of the negotiations is in many ways a sort of soft threat from the West in and of itself. It's saying that even the supposed neutral ground that you have to come negotiate on, it's still a NATO state. It's still the other hegemon on the Black Sea. And it's showing, I think it's sort of an inevitable flex against the Russians that, look, we are right here on your doorstep. And even if you do take more and more territory in Ukraine, you are not, the hegemon in this Black Sea region, and you're only warm water port that you really have in a relevant geostrategic part of the world. And again, with Turkey being a NATO country, they are in many ways complicit in the crimes and the support that other NATO countries give to Ukraine. And we know that in many ways, much like Turkey refuses to fully break ties, so both trade and otherwise, with Israel, they also refuse to actually be neutral in this conflict and are very much supporters of Ukraine. But other NATO states, big news, of course, is that Germany has decided to supply Ukraine with a $5 billion new aid package that includes the long-range Taurus KEPD 350 air-launched cruise missiles, with transfers planned for later this year, which again, these will allow the Ukrainians to strike deep into Russian territory. And Merz openly says that he is giving these weapons to Ukraine for the purpose of them striking deeper into Russia, taking the fight to them, which, again, remember initially in the war, this was a total red line. And when Ukraine started striking into Russia at all, even with homemade drones and these sorts of things, the West, was very unhappy with that. On the Taurus, it has a greater than 500-kilometer range, precision-guided, hardened target penetrating warhead. It will enhance Ukraine's ability to hit high-value Russian military assets far behind the front lines. Russia has condemned the move as a very dangerous trend. So, again, Merz, in my opinion, and the Germans are using this sort of Trump anger flare-up against Russia for its massive Iskander missile strikes on Kiev and its advancements all across the front line to do this sort of aggressive escalatory move in a moment where they don't think Trump will feel the need to restrain them, or if they think that Trump will see it and be like, yeah, good, let them do that, which, maybe the United States even gave them the go-ahead to do this to begin with. That wouldn't surprise me at all. And as far as the Putin story of his helicopter being shot down, the former head of the office of the U.S. Secretary of State, Lawrence Wilkerson, he recently went on the Judge Napolitano podcast, and he said, attempted attack on President Putin's helicopter with drones received very little attention here in the West, as you know. Could this have happened without information from MI6, the CIA, and Mossad? Any of them or all at once? And does this mean that the United States, Britain, or Israel, which is not particularly involved in this war, is also involved in the killings and are responsible for what they have done? Obviously, he's connecting the fact that the United States only very briefly stopped intelligence sharing with Ukraine. It's been going for months and months now. The UK never stopped intelligence sharing with Ukraine. So could this intelligence about Putin's helicopter in Kursk have been supplied by the West? It wouldn't surprise me if it was. I don't know the extent to which Ukraine operates its own independent intelligence along certain parts of the front line. Obviously, they do have, at this point, a fairly fleshed out intelligence state and apparatus, but as far as the actual operations on the front, it wouldn't surprise me if pretty much all intelligence at least faces some sort of filter and interaction from the US or the UK. So it's not, I think, a stretch to posit any of this at all. And the other big news, some other big pieces of news, at least from, other adjacent spheres outside of Ukraine that still have to do with this conflict. We have recent reports, this is from Eurasia Daily, residents of the Suwalki corridor are moving out in fear of a Russian invasion. There was a big report on this from the German news source Bild. It says, against the background of growing tensions, residents of the strategically important Suwalki corridor, which, for those that don't know, is the small 65-kilometer gap between Königsberg, the Kaliningrad Oblast of Russia, and Belarus. That's a very small border between Poland and Lithuania. that says residents of the strategically important Suwalki corridor began to leave the region en masse. It is reported by the German newspaper Bild. It is noted that this narrow piece of land, 65 kilometers between Poland and Lithuania, is a vulnerable place in NATO's defense. The military believes that in the event of a conflict, the Russian armed forces can strike from two sides. Russian artillery capable of hitting at more than 30 kilometers covers the entire Suwalki corridor. With its help, it would be possible to cut off the Baltic countries from the rest of Europe. We don't want to be the first to be hit, residents say, amid the exercises and militarization of the region. As reported by EA Daily, their former head of the National Security Bureau of Poland, former Deputy Minister of National Defense Stanislav Kozay, issued another batch of scarecrows designed for the local man in the street. They say the Russians will enter the Suwalki corridor, a 60-kilometer stretch connecting Belarus with the Russian enclave on the Baltic Sea. Lithuania plans to strengthen and modernize the Suwalki corridor. This was stated by Deputy Minister of Defense of the Republic, Tomas Godliauskas. And, we've been hearing about things going on in Kaliningrad with Belarus for a long time now. We're also hearing, of course, from Syrski and Zelensky that coming up sometime this summer, Belarus will be getting more directly involved. Of course, Lukashenko denies this, but, anything can happen. And potentially, maybe people think that there will be maybe him denying it means that Belarus won't get involved in Ukraine, but perhaps Belarus is going to be getting involved in Poland and Lithuania and connecting with Königsberg and the Kaliningrad Oblast. However, I've always been skeptical that something like that would occur without Belarus formally joining Greater Russia first. But again, anything is possible. And the defense agreements and the Union State, I'm sure, would easily allow Belarus to, connect with Königsberg without any sort of political contradiction within the, political technology they have established there. But the other story in that similar region, of course, is about the Russian fleet. Russia has deployed its warships to escort its Shadow Fleet tankers through the Gulf of Finland. Very recently, a ship that was flagged for Gabon was attempted to be boarded and inspected and stopped and even seized by the Estonian authorities. They're imposing these stricter and stricter inspection requirements on these fleets. And this, of course, comes, as you said, Dimitri, as more and more threatened sanctions have been happening on China and India, who are the main recipients of a lot of the oil through these shadow fleets. Like I said, they're flagged to countries like Gabon, Comoros, Marshall Islands, these, African and South Pacific, countries and islands that, are always playing the different diplomatic games with who they're allied with and the trade relations and whatnot. But again, we know that there are Chinese trawlers that cut cables in the Baltic Sea. We know that there are attempted helicopter landings and boardings of these ships. We know that, there's the church persecutions in Estonia. We know this going on in the Suwalki corridor. So I think in many ways, outside of the Ukrainian front line itself in Donbass and in Kharkov and Sumy and these other places, I think the obvious next place that could go hot in lieu of this conflict as far as Russia's face-off against the collective West, I think it's very likely to be the Baltic region, whether it be at sea or on land. So unless you have anything else to say about the situation of what I just discussed with Russia and the Baltics and whatnot, Dimitri, we need to move on to the United States and the Indo-Pacific, but I'd love your thoughts on what I just discussed.
Yeah, of course, just a brief commentary. The Suwalki Gap crisis, I don't blame, the Polish or Lithuanian citizens or anyone really living in that particular area because it's of such a geostrategic interest. Like Kaliningrad, whenever you speak to Russians, everybody anticipates the inevitable attack on Kaliningrad during a Third World War breakout in Europe in particular. It's almost, Kaliningrad is being prepared for war as a fortress. It's completely surrounded. Just for reference, it wasn't always a Prussian-German territory. The ancient Prussian Slavs used to live there. So technically speaking, Kaliningrad, it's very much a territory which was shared by many different ethnicities and tribes of people in the past. This is, of course, predating even the schism during the reign of Charlemagne and his descendants, the Carolingians, and the emergence of the Holy Roman Empire as it began to spread its sort of filioque-based Christianity against the so-called pagan Slavs living on that southern coast of the Baltic Sea. But Lithuania is a very strategic country. Like Lithuania historically, since at least the time of the schism onwards for the next 500 years, officially Lithuanian government officials would use Russian. Russian was the most spoken language in Lithuania historically until recent times. In fact, even all the Gediminovich, the dynasty that ruled Lithuania, all of the nobles would speak Russian. They would speak Latin, of course, in terms of court official documents when signing and discussing diplomatic matters with Western kings, dukes, and other leaders traveling from the Holy Roman Empire and other places of the Roman Catholic world. But generally speaking, Russian was the official language. If you read any ancient Lithuanian document from like the 1300s or the 1200s, they're all going to be essentially in this old Church Slavonic style Russian. So it's almost legible for a modern Russian reader to read ancient Lithuanian documents. And so Lithuania historically is very much contested territory by, I think, many of the surrounding nations. Obviously, Germany has its own interests there, as we recall before the beginning of World War II, the whole Klaipėda Memel situation where Nazi Germany essentially utilized local Germanic sort of influences to annex the city of Memel, Klaipėda, on the coast of the short-lived Lithuanian Democratic Masonic state, which was very interesting in 1939. And there's all these different considerations going into the circumstances surrounding the tensions growing in the Baltic Sea. And also, just recall, in March of this year, I think we covered it on a previous episode, the future King of England, Prince William, traveled directly to Estonia, and he conducted military exercises, wearing Estonian and British military uniforms with Estonian troops, which I think is a big sign. Russian political commentators have oftentimes summarized that it's essentially the UK, the former British Empire, which has held influence over the Baltic states for a long time. And historically, even during the time of, say, Tsar Paul I, so this is the early 1800s, in the proto-Napoleonic conflicts when Russia was actually allied with Napoleon, before the assassination of Tsar Paul, the British Empire brought their fleet into the Baltic in essentially a threat to attack St. Petersburg. So the Russian military exercise on the Baltic fleet now is very much has a huge historical significance. Bringing out 20, 25 of these battleships. The Baltic Sea fleet was never obviously the size of the Black Sea fleet, but it has a rich history going back to Peter the Great. So for Russians, this is very much a sign of, essentially expressing their sovereignty. And just keep in mind, just the fact that Finland, right, and all the surrounding nations have joined NATO under the Putin presidency. So Russian sovereignty over the Baltics, Conrad, is very much a sign of Putin reestablishing himself, proving that he actually isn't an incompetent politician. Just for reference, it's during Putin's presidency in March of 2004 that all the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, became member states of NATO. So I think it was March 2004. And in April 2024, Finland and Sweden joined NATO. So all of these great undertakings that will in the future, I think, threaten the sovereignty of Russia and its defense interests took place, again, not under Yeltsin, not under some sort of incompetent Gorbachev, but they took place under President Putin's presidency. So he needs to sort of reestablish himself as someone who looks after Russia's interests in the Baltics, because really that hasn't been happening in recent times. And I think Estonia should really worry about who it's threatening, because whether or not Article 5 of NATO is actually works, because we've never really seen it in practice, I think Estonia will be one of the first countries to really test that consideration out. And last thing I'll mention about Belarus and the Suwalki corridor is that during the talks on the 15th of May, during the first Istanbul agreement, coincidentally, Andrei Belousov, the defense minister of Russia, where was he during the Istanbul talks? Well, he traveled to meet with Lukashenko personally, and they discussed joint Russian-Belarusian defense interests. And imagine how scary it is for Ukraine. The literal defense minister, who is a strong Orthodox Christian, travels to speak to Lukashenko, and Andrei Belousov made some sort of conjecture about Western influence and encroachment on Belarusian interests, and Lukashenko very loudly, in his boisterous tone, responds to Andrei Belousov, and he makes sure that all the cameras hear him, and he says that Belarus will make sure to defend its own interests. It is not planning to attack Ukraine. And just that, the fact that he brought that up, I think brought fear to many Ukrainians and even those in the Suwalki corridor. Because remember, Belarus still has that Wagner training camp. There are still thousands of Wagner troops stationed in Belarus training the Belarusian military. There's a lot of collaboration taking place there. So I think going into the future, we'll definitely have to keep our eyes on that sort of northwestern portion of the Russian world. And in relation to Lukashenko, I think he's been a more or less a decent ally for the Russian Federation. We'll see where this long-term relationship goes. We know Lukashenko is one of the most experienced politicians in the world, despite the fact that he only rules over a fairly poor and small state in the European and even in the worldly context. But still, in terms of experience, surviving elections, probably surviving various coup attempts, he is one of the most experienced in, I think, recent European history. maybe even more than President Putin himself. So we'll see where all of this goes. And in relation to, his counterpart, Conrad, I think if we pivot to, say, North Africa, the North African Lukashenko, Field Marshal Haftar, has also recently been in headlines in terms of his family and his particular East Libyan regime securing incredible amounts of Russian hardware and defense aid. And footage shows Russian tanks, Russian jeeps, all this equipment, which essentially Russia could have probably used for the special military operation. But I think this is some of the excess that Russia created. Remember, Russian defense trade has fallen significantly by as much as 40% since the beginning of the special military operation for whatever reason. But it looks like Russian sales of military hardware to Field Marshal Haftar in East Libya have been successful and ongoing. I think people are estimating that most of this hardware was sold to him in 2022, 2023, 2024, so just recently. And it's state-of-the-art technology. Like, it turns his military capabilities into something that the official Tripoli government in West Libya, the sort of essentially Western democratic, that, by the way, in Tripoli, the protests are still ongoing. So it'll be very interesting how the Libyan situation develops further, Conrad, if you have any opinions on that, because I think this is one of those areas which many countries are looking at, in particular, like we mentioned last week, the Palestinian refugee situation. And again, Turkish interests are also very heavily invested into this North African location.
Yeah, no, the situation in Libya is, escalating very much in the favor of Haftar. Lukashenko and Belarus, they opened an embassy in Benghazi, which is where his government is headquartered. The Tripoli, which is the historic capital of Libya, their government, with their territorial control over in Western Libya, is seemingly on the verge of collapse now that Turkey, who was their former supporter, seems to be allied with Russia and Haftar and the Egyptians at this point against the Tripoli-based government. There are apparently 2,000 Turkish military operators going to Libya to help train Haftar and the Libyan National Army, who are under the political control of the Libyan Congress, whereas, the other executive offices were on the other side of things. So not only is this obviously happening because of Turkish and Egyptian rapprochement, sort of due to the Israel crisis and the Palestinian issue, but I think, ironically, because Belarus, who obviously plays a big diplomatic role for Russian foreign policy, Belarus and Lukashenko, they've always been allied with Erdogan and with Aliyev, even closer than the Russians have. So this, Turkish pivot towards the Russian side on this front in the Mediterranean might have to do with the Belarusian connection. That wouldn't surprise me at all. But I think, again, the fact that the negotiations are happening in Istanbul, and now Russia seems to be willing to ally with Turkey in Libya. In theory, people might think this is a good sign towards, Russia and Turkey not having conflict in the future. But again, I believe Strelkov and others who have analyzed the situation correctly are correct that the Russians are fools if they think they can trust Turkey and if they can trust Ankara. And I think the Syria situation proves that. And I think, again, ironically, Russia and Turkey, I think, are in similar boats regarding Israel, because Turkey, they may be more strongly condemning Israel and threatening to support Hamas. But fundamentally, Russia behind the scenes has made it clear that they have a sort of security guarantee with Israel that they are not allowed to be destroyed and that they would fight against their own allies, Iran and others, to protect Israel in certain situations. And Turkey, of course, we know is still like the fifth largest trader with Israel. They are still, facilitating Azerbaijan's massive energy trade that they have with Israel, who are open allies. Israel and Turkey are negotiating in Azerbaijan, in Baku, over the past few months. So, again, the situation in Libya may be promising for Russo-Turkish relations, but in general, I think both sides are unfortunately in danger of siding with world Jewry against, I think, what would be the righteous side in the conflict in the Levant. And Turkey is still very much surrounding Russia to the south, as well as pushing them out of Syria and forcing, to this day, there are still refugees residing in the Khmeimim air base and the other air bases in Latakia and the regions that, Russia still has some territorial control over in Syria, despite the fact that Lavrov and others say that they are fully with the new Syrian government. In many ways, this is, I think, sort of a cope. And who knows how much of it has to do with Russia's covert relations and their seeming behind-the-scenes guarantees with Israel.
And perhaps I'll just last comment on North Africa, Conrad. The most concerning thing that I think we would all hate to see would be for Russia, supporting Field Marshal Haftar with Russia's military bases, or at least maybe future port bases or air bases that it's building in Libya, and that maybe it will invest into as Libya becomes a second Syria, essentially like a plan B for Russia, in order to keep the presence in the Mediterranean, for Russia to somehow become an accomplice or assist the Trump administration in the ethnic cleansing of the Gazan Palestinians, because this plan was floated a few weeks ago of potentially moving Gazan Palestinians to Libya. And I think we would hate to see Russians in some way, at least the Russian government and the Russian military, somehow collaborating in building refugee camps or anything of that sort in Libya. Again, this is simply a hypothetical speculation, but just putting my fears out there, because that would be entirely horrible. At the moment, Russia has, somewhat been working for a peace in the Middle East, so to speak, in the Palestinian context, continuing to invite Mahmoud Abbas to the BRICS summit, to various meetings, the 9th of May, for example. But still, they haven't really taken that big step as the Houthis and Iran have taken in terms of actually protecting the Palestinian people against genocide. And we hope they don't actually become an accomplice in some of that ethnic cleansing and moving of large populations, because that's somewhat historically analogous to what perhaps Stalin did to the people of the Caucasus after the Second World War, moving them all to Kazakhstan. And I'm sure the Muslim world would not appreciate Russia conducting itself in that fashion. So that's very interesting. But sort of mentioning another area of the world, which we haven't covered last week, but I think this week there's been a huge escalation was taking place, and especially during this Trump presidency, when generally speaking, more or less the consensus was that it'll be mostly a peaceful discussion of events taking place all over the world. Trump will be pushing for collaboration, economic deals with various countries in order to renegotiate some of the debt that the U.S. has built up. We see an opposite of that. Pete Hegseth travels to Southeast Asia and outspokenly very much states that the US will support Taiwan no matter what against the evil communist Chinese. He doesn't use the word evil, but essentially that's what he rhetorically points towards. Again, it's that strong celebration of Taiwanese independence, mind you, that Pete Hegseth seems to be pointing towards. And remember that controversy a few weeks ago, Conrad, or months now, where Pete Hegseth, there was some sort of issues within the State Department and the Department of Defense in the US. There was questions about whether or not Pete Hegseth will stay. I think at the moment he's very much playing this hyper-Zionist, anti-communist Cold Warrior role, and there was new trailers even released for recruitment in America, which is incredibly concerning. All of this happening at the same time as the US apparently increasing the number of troops that are stationed in Taiwan, which could, again, preemptively cause huge tensions with the Chinese, not just in a military type fashion. I don't think China has a plan to, so to speak, invade Taiwan in an amphibian fashion anytime in the near future until they're prepared. I think China understands the US supremacy on the water, at least in the Pacific at the moment. Until some sort of internal crisis takes place in America, or maybe America becomes overinvested in the Middle East, then I think China will potentially look at expanding to some of these shoals, some of the islands surrounding Taiwan, and then maybe moving onto the mainland. But at the moment, the US is very much posturing itself as the defenders of liberty and democracy. It's very much Cold War rhetoric that still rules that Pacific theater. And very unfortunately, all the various abuses that, we just have to call it what it is. It's like these Chinese ships, Conrad, they are bullying the poor Filipinos, the Filipinos who are trying to at least somewhat assert themselves in their regional waters. The Chinese are simply breaching them, and the Filipinos, the only real support they can get from any nearby nation would be America. So very much, if you look at countries like New Zealand, the Philippines, Singapore, Australia, all of them depend very heavily on that American naval dominance, which I think Pete Hegseth is kind of pointing towards. That he's stating that, look, we're going to stand a united front against these evil communist Chinese. And that all of this sounds so ridiculous when you consider that China today is a major capitalist power. Like, it's literally the factory of the world. And this comes into conflict with all the tariff discussions that Trump is having, and the fact that China is trading with the entire world. It's just, rhetorically, it's meant to confuse only the most uneducated of American citizens. And probably this is who the military recruitment ads are being catered towards as well. So it's very concerning. I think Americans really shouldn't buy any of this slop.
No, I completely agree. And we have to remember that all this escalation against China is coming amidst the backdrop of, Trump's tariffs being in flux right now. It was just a few days ago that a court blocked all of Trump's tariffs, said they needed to immediately stop, and over the next 30 days needed to be phased out at the executive administrative level. But then a different court basically reinstated them as of this past today, pretty
Hmm.
much. So this is from Al Jazeera. It says a federal appeals court has temporarily reinstated U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs a day after a trade court ruled that it exceeded the authorities granted to the president. The United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit in Washington temporarily blocked the lower court's decision on Thursday, but provided no reasoning for the decision, only giving the plaintiffs until June 5th to respond. The Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit granted an emergency motion from the Trump administration arguing that a halt is critical for the country's national security. The White House applauded the move. You can assume even if we lose tariff cases, we will find another way, trade advisor Peter Navarro
Hmm.
said. And of course, I'm anti-free trade. I'm a tariff supporter. So this is ostensibly a good thing politically here domestically, but this in theory does allow more rigorous tariffs to be put on China in the future. Although Trump does claim to be cutting a deal with China. He even released something about how China was going to get destroyed. And I think, but now that they're going to do okay, which in many ways was sort of, I think, him preparing for the tariffs to be struck down. But I don't know, I guess they must not have been expecting them to get reinstated so quickly. So again, the big quote from Pete Hegseth that he gave in Singapore that I think was the most bellicose, he said, any attempt by communist China to conquer Taiwan by force will result in devastating
Wow.
consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world. There's no reason to sugarcoat it. The threat China poses is real and could be imminent. So this comes also amidst the backdrop of the recent admission by U.S. Navy Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. He said during congressional testimony on May 15th that over 500 U.S. military personnel are stationed on Taiwan, which in the past there had only ever been acknowledged up to 41 temporarily stationed and training military personnel. A year ago, that was sort of the understanding. Now it's well over 500. And it's been admitted under oath by U.S. military personnel, which is again openly defying many of Beijing's red lines that they have for the island. And of course, China in response said that they're going to be doing something big. They've already been doing a lot of exercises. A lot of their Coast Guard and military ships have been getting within a few kilometers, even a few hundred meters of some of the outlying Taiwanese islands, which is sort of fueling a lot of speculation and supposed intelligence leaks. It says that this is from The Independent. China could seize Taiwan's outlying islands, U.S. intelligence report warns. Experts warn Taiwanese archipelagos of Kinmen and Matsu are particularly vulnerable to Chinese capture. China could seize Taiwan's smaller outlying islands as a tactic to intimidate the government in Taipei, a U.S. intelligence report has warned. Though the vast majority of its population lives on the main island of Taiwan, Taipei also controls a number of smaller island chains, including the Kinmen and Matsu, close to the Chinese mainland. The protests in Taiping in the South China Sea and the Penghu archipelago off Taiwan's southeastern coast. Seizing and attempting to annex these islands is among a number of military options available to Beijing as it continues to threaten Taiwan with a wholesale invasion, according to the latest worldwide threat assessment report released earlier this month by the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. Beijing claims Taiwan is a breakaway province, and Chinese President Xi Jinping has threatened to reunite the island with the mainland by force if necessary. That goes on. Kinmen, at its closest point, is less than 2 kilometers away from Chinese controlled territory. And we've talked about this in the past how China, if they are going to make a move on Taiwan, it could be preceded even years or months in advance by moves on these islands. Or, it could all happen in one day. In theory, we don't exactly know. But China has also, much like what's going on in the Baltic Sea with the cutting of communications cables and pipelines and stuff, many internet and telecommunications cables between Kinmen Island and mainland China and these islands and Taiwan itself have been severed by Chinese ships and different actors acting within the straits between the island. So the fact that Pete Hegseth is effectively threatening U.S. military action if Taiwan is moved on, I
Hmm.
think China really does need to assert itself. And from a diplomatic perspective, from a balance of power perspective, I think they should seize some of these islands in the sense that I don't think the U.S. will go to war over these islands per se, and it will sort of restore a sort of, again, an equality understanding between these two groups because clearly they're saying that if you make a move on Taiwan and occupy Taipei itself and remove the currently elected civilian government, that will trigger United States military response. Will capturing the Kinmen and Matsu Islands trigger a U.S. military response? I'm very skeptical of that. So I think China, if they aren't willing to test those waters, it shows that either they truly are committed to the long game and are understanding that U.S. decline is inevitable, or they are much more afraid than many people would like to admit. But before we pivot to a few more African stories, I want to talk about some things on the U.S. home front. Of course, we discussed Harvard no longer being allowed to have foreign students, which, again, I'm no supporter of Harvard. I'm no supporter of foreign students in the United States. But to me, it seems like an egregious overreach of federal power if this was something that was apparently we never could have done before for any other legitimate ideological reason against the, cancerous ideology coming out of the campuses. Now, suddenly, when there's criticism of Israel and protests, we're allowed to completely control what our elite institutions do and are now trying to impose a curriculum on them that will be dictated by Israel and the federal government. In light of this headline, Marco Rubio says vigorous new visa policy will prevent Israel critics from entering the United States. Rubio said the U.S. will hold international organizations and nations accountable for rhetoric against Israel. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said on Wednesday that the U.S. is implementing a vigorous new visa policy to prevent people from entering the U.S. who are critical of Israel, which he conflates with anti-Semitism. We have implemented a vigorous new visa policy that will prevent foreign nationals from coming into the United States to foment hatred against our Jewish community, Rubio said in a recorded video message to an Israeli conference on combating anti-Semitism. Rubio said the U.S. will hold international organizations and nations accountable. Trump administration recently paused all interviews for foreigners seeking student visas as it prepares to expand vetting and screening of social media. The Trump administration has been attempting to deport foreign students for protesting against Israel's genocidal war in Gaza, activism that U.S. officials have labeled anti-Semitic, despite Jewish involvement in the demonstrations. In one case, Rubio revoked the visa of a PhD student at Tufts University. That goes on to talk about other students that have been expelled. And again, the other big headline that I think is directly tied with this is the fact that Trump is effectively calling on Palantir and contracting with Alex Karp's Palantir to create a database for the information about every single American with their data information, potentially biometrics, these sorts of things. This is a story from the New York Times. The push has put a key Palantir product called Foundry into at least 4 federal agencies, including DHS and the Health and Human Services Department. Widely adopting Foundry, which organizes and analyzes data, paves the way for Mr. Trump to easily merge information from different agencies, the government officials said. Creating detailed portraits of Americans based on government data is not just a pipe dream. The Trump administration has already sought access to hundreds of data points on citizens and others through government databases, including their bank account numbers, the amount of their student debt, their medical claims, and any disability status. This goes on to talk about how it's going to be used to target immigrants, which is total crap. I support anything that would target illegal immigrants and getting people out of this country, but this is obviously going to be used, as it said, with student debt and these other things. It was obviously being used to target people protesting the Gaza genocide. And of course, the fact that this is being done by Palantir, who at this point have accumulated at one point over $113 million, as well as a $795 million contracting deal with the Department of Defense. Again, they're founded by Peter Thiel, who's ultimately behind J.D. Vance and many other current political projects, Michael Anton, who people are pushing for national security advisor, many of these other characters. And of course, he founded Palantir with Alex Karp, obsessive Jewish Zionist who says his greatest fear in America is that Christian nationalists come to power and defenestrate him, throw him out a window for being Jewish. He also talked about how his technology at Palantir and their algorithms single-handedly stopped the rise of the far right in Europe. I'm assuming he's speaking about things going on in the UK and Germany and other countries where, huge groups and networks of dissidents were collectively rounded up. I'm talking about the Reichsbürger conspiracy in Germany. I'm talking about the nationalist factions within the German special forces that have been uncovered, things going on in France, the Netherlands, these other places where clearly deep algorithmic learning and even infiltrative, monitoring softwares have, been used to imprison dissidents and suppress the rise of, truly right-wing parties that would stand up against world Jewry and, mass migration and the Great Replacement and other conspiracies that are being perpetrated against Western Christian nations. Trump, who, again, he's been supported by J.D. Vance and Peter Thiel monetarily in the past. Peter Thiel, again, getting J.D. Vance as vice president. Clearly, he's had a lot of institutional infiltration into this administration. I think he is, of course, part of the PayPal mafia with Elon Musk and, has access to a lot of his networks. So, this infiltration by Palantir, this is exactly what I've talked about in the past with how Israel and world Jewry and finance are allowing a lot of right-wing and dissident and even identitarian discourse and ideas to be made mainstream. the white South Africa stuff, which these things are always allowed when they also serve Israeli interests. South Africa accuses Israel of genocide in the International Court of Justice. Well, now America is accusing South Africa of white genocide. Coincidence? I don't really think so. Much like now that, Jews in Israel are being threatened in the United States, it's like, well, we can allow people to be anti-immigrant. We can allow people to deport these foreign students, these left-wing protesters. Oh, just as long as they were protesting Israel, that's what really matters. We're going to be against anti-immigration. We're going to be in favor of mass deportations. We're going to, tell white people that, it's okay to be white and these other things. But as long as Jews are part of what it means to be white, and as long as you don't get too crazy with the Christianity, as long as you're not a LARPer, and as long as you're not, a crazy conspiracy theorist, these other sorts of things, that's sort of the game being played right now. And I've talked about, potential operations that, have been planned since the COVID days when, even with Stephen Miller having been involved, who, again, he's kind of the perfect example. He's this identitarian. He's, racist based supposedly, but he clearly is also a radical Zionist and I think is willing to implement a lot of draconian state policies that, in the name of, supporting an identitarian immigration regime that will ultimately be used against domestic dissidents that stand up against world Jewry and Zionism and, plans to have the U.S. be a war golem for the Zionist entity in the Middle East. So I think that's something that everyone needs to be aware of. And Palantir, Foundry, these technologies, these are not to be trusted. Alex Karp, in my opinion, is one of the most untrustworthy characters, somebody that should be far, far away from the levers of power. Yet, as far as I can tell, he seems to be becoming very quickly one of the most powerful people, not just in the West, but frankly in the world, with how he's been empowered by every Western government and how his technology, is very much on the cutting edge and is supported by, people very close to, the highest echelons of power currently operating right now. But I'd love to hear any of your thoughts that you have on that, Dimitri, before we talk about a few things going on in the Congo and then move on to church news.
I think your analysis has absolutely been on point. Absolutely. The Trump administration, there's a Zionist wing, which is heavily collaborating with the tech bro wing. Again, it's this BAP-related crowd, the so-called Zionists are good because they push American interests hegemonically, globally, worldwide. And that multipolarity is actually a risk to American influence. And nobody ever critically analyzes what exactly American cultural influence around the world brings, what kind of values it spreads through its embassies, through some of the corporations that operate from within America. And again, very anti-Christian things. And naturally, unfortunately, the hardworking nature of American people is being exploited by some of these bad actors. And I think that's politically as well as in the private sphere, various corporations. And, this is exactly what happened to the USSR, which was used as a vehicle to push a degenerate, I would say, destructive anti-Christian ideology to many of its neighboring countries, which has still left such a bad taste in many of the Europeans that, the Russian Federation today has essentially a mostly hostile, somewhat negative relationship with almost every other majority Orthodox Christian country, which is a huge shame. And, this is what bad foreign policy leads you towards. And hopefully, again, America really fixes things up before any sort of world catastrophe or calamity takes place, right? This is, again, the hope. And this is why people voted for President Donald J. Trump in the first place. In the Congo, very interesting developments, Conrad. I think, given the North African situation, the still persistence of the Democratic Republic of Congo is still fighting ongoing, despite all the mineral deals announced by Trump. And again, I feel like these mineral deals were simply made both in the Ukrainian case and in the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, not for some sort of economic gain, but for victory in their headlines. It's almost like an addiction to social media. Like Trump needed to appear as if he's this peacekeeper. He's someone who benefits America economically in terms of he makes deals with these sort of war-torn lands. He wants to rebuild them. Even this weird novelty like Palestine, rebuilding plan, which again, this idea that he's going to rebuild Gaza, like he has these bizarre reconstruction plans. Maybe he is like a real estate planner and a real estate mogul because he does have all these reconstructive projects which he wants to push onto these countries, which in fact probably don't even need that. What they need is some sort of stability and a reconciliation amongst different ethnic groups and interest groups within them. But M23 continues to be active on the eastern side of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we know absolutely that, as the US notice it sends troops to Taiwan to defend against the alleged threat of Chinese communist invasion, it doesn't send any peacekeeping troops. Not that I want peacekeeping troops of America in Central Africa somewhere, right? But it doesn't send peacekeeping troops to a place which actually requires them, where there's active cases of child abuse, trafficking of humans, all kinds of abuses against women, elderly, and all the other vulnerable people in those jungles. So the interests, the economic and the globalist interests of America, they lie deeply with the ruling class and not with actual people around the world that need help. I think that's like a key thing that we're noticing.
No, I totally agree. However, I do believe there is talk, and there has been talk of sending, Eric Prince tier private military contractors, and that's not because of any humanitarian interest in helping people. It's, of course, to secure diamond mines and other, important resource mines that are important in the production of semiconductors and electronics, securing them for Israeli Jewish national and billionaire and diamond mogul Dan Gertler, who of course wants peace in this region and solid jurisdiction over it by a certain power that's allied and has deals with the United States, so he can extract the most resources out of this as possible, and properly help fund the Israeli genocide effort in Gaza personally. And of course, M23, as you said, Dimitri, they continue to advance despite the fact that on May 29th, former Congo President Joseph Kabila, who is still a very relevant social and political figure, he arrived in the eastern city of Goma for talks. He wants to help end the crisis in the region. Of course, this apparently didn't work too effectively because immediately afterwards, reports came in that M23 had crossed the Lahulu River and captured the small town of Peti in the North Kivu region in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. M23 have also been advanced beyond Peti towards Kisone. Meanwhile, the group has launched a pincer from the north, taking the town of Kilambo, and the attack is aimed at encircling a large number of Democratic Republic of Congo armed forces located on the heights of the Buhimba, which is vital for the defense of Pinga, just 9 kilometers away from the front line. Even though the Trump administration signed mineral deals with both sides, as well as a so-called ceasefire deal, the war remains in full swing. So when people ask you and tell you, oh, the Third World War isn't ongoing, just remember that there are very hot conflicts that ultimately the fact that they're ongoing does not benefit the ruling class and the people that want to pull the strings in every country around the world. So you're simply not hearing about them. But don't forget that in Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, in Central America, in the Middle East, of course, in Europe, in the South Pacific, in India, Pakistan, there are ongoing hot conflicts. So World War is definitely now. If you ever, were questioning the basis of the show and our analysis here, I think it's pretty indisputable at this point. But the other region in Africa that is sort of becoming relevant is the Red Sea region. The Sudan Civil War in many ways is relevant now because Trump in the West seems to have tentatively weighed in on the side of the United Arab Emirates and their proxy, the Rapid Support Forces. And I think the reason that this is relevant and the reason that it's happening is because the West, despite not perhaps wanting to support these less than savory Rapid Support Forces, who I'm not saying that the Sudanese junta is necessarily innocent, but I think they were clearly more brutal than the forces they were fighting against. But of course now the West and Trump see that they want to accuse the Sudanese forces and the junta of war crimes, despite the rest of the international community mostly pointing the finger at the Rapid Support Forces. This comes, I think, due to the fact that on the Horn of Africa, Russia and China and these other groups are gaining influence rapidly, and the U.S. is losing it quickly because Ethiopia, their defense ministers were recently meeting with Russian authorities. We, of course, have Djibouti, a very close ally of China, with its port there. Sudan, the Sudanese junta itself have promised Russia a port on the Red Sea, which would obviously shift the balance of power there dramatically. The Yemeni side of the Red Sea, of course, is controlled by Ansar Allah and the Houthis, who were only able to stop bombing it because they were basically granted the ability to continue bombing Israel proper. So the Red Sea is still very vulnerable at this point. And as Africa moves towards multipolarity, the U.S. and the former colonial forces, I think, fear what could happen there. Eritrea as well, formerly an outpost of Israel. There are actually Israeli bases on some of those Eritrean islands, has moved very quickly towards Russia and China as well against the United States. And we're now seeing more and more calls for regime change in Eritrea because it is very much an authoritarian regime. Some people call it the North Korea of Africa, but you're going to see more and more headlines with that phrase because the U.S. has turned against Eritrea and are realizing now that the Horn of Africa is almost entirely aligned with the multipolar sphere of things. Somalia, failed state, so can't really be relied upon in any capacity as a starting point for any kind of operation. So That could be why the U.S. is deciding to put its finger on the scale in the Sudanese civil war, but it seems like it's too little too late because the RSF have already been almost entirely driven out of Khartoum, the capital area of Sudan. So, might, like I said, be too little too late. But the other big news, and I think it's time to pivot towards church news, unless you have any other stories you'd like to cover, Dimitri, outside of church affairs. We have to talk about it is in Africa, so it's part of the region we're discussing. And that, of course, is what's going on with St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. There have been a lot of conflicting reports. We've seen headlines about how it's imminently and already been closed and taken over by the Egyptian authorities. And then there's people saying this is fake news. The Egyptian authorities denied this. But we are having responses written by Archbishop Elpidophoros of America and other archbishops are talking about how even if there is still access and the monks are still there right now, the persecution is very much real. And I have a report here, this is from the National Herald. It says Archbishop Damianos of Sinai speaks to the National Herald about the closure of St. Catherine's Monastery. Archbishop Damianos of Sinai, Ferran Enrico, an abbot of the Holy Monastery of St. Catherine at Mount Sinai, spoke exclusively to the National Herald about the recent developments of the monastery, which have reached the brink of eviction as a result of an Egyptian court ruling that considers him and the entire Sinai Brotherhood as squatters, disregarding their 15th-century-long presence there. Currently, 18 to 20 monks reside at the monastery. And of course, those that don't know, St. Catherine's Monastery, established by St. Justinian the Great, and houses such incredible relics of the church as the burning bush that Moses saw, in the Old Testament, where God revealed himself to him. Of course, the Sinai Pantocrator icon, one of the earliest icons depicting Christ, both theologically depicting his two natures as well as accurately depicting his, Eastern Levantine appearance based on icons ultimately that would have been produced by saints like St. Luke. This article goes on to say Archbishop Damianos is presently in Cairo, Egypt, from where he gave the interview by phone, and he plans to return to Athens within this week. He stated, for over 10 years now, we have been in and out of court because our right of ownership over this barren land, which we have always considered ours, handed down to us by sanctified individuals, is being denied. On one hand, these are holy places visited by people from around the world, from which the Egyptian government benefits, yet they do not wish to recognize them as our property. He further explained the authorities, particularly the Antiquities Service, tell us that yes, you may use them, but they belong to us. And only belatedly did they realize that it was we who have safeguarded these treasures by our own labor, our own efforts, and our own resources. From the 6th century to the present, now they say we have no right to manage them. The Archbishop emphasized, we protest vigorously, but all our protests are in vain because the more powerful party simply says, I want it this way, and so it shall be. He stressed, this is a grave blow for us and a disgrace. We want to continue managing what we have preserved for centuries at great cost and from our own funds. And now the Antiquities Services come and says, you will do as we tell you. Archbishop Damianos told us, I am 91 years old today and I have lived at the monastery since the age of 27. You can imagine the pain in my heart. He was asked what will happen now that the court has issued an eviction order. He responded, it is judicial manipulation. Back in 1980, the government declared that in areas without a land registry, property owners should file declarations. The monastery was among the first to submit such declarations for everything, small gardens, chapels. In total, we submitted 71 files and received a receipt of acknowledgement. We waited for the committee to come and confirm our ownership. Others with far more land were granted ownership, but we received nothing. 20 years later, the Egyptian state tells us it's too much, or this or that excuse, and in the end, we were not given nothing. Now they tell us you have no right to be here, you are newcomers, when we have lived in Sinai since the 6th century. He noted we got caught up in unrest during the period of fanatic Muslim uprisings, and they began to see us as invaders, as if we had recently purchased these lands as many others have done illegally. The authorities accuse us of adverse possession and are even demanding payment for it. At this point, there is no lawyer in Egypt who speaks Greek or is Greek to defend us. When asked what they intend to do moving forward, he replied, lately in this situation, we have begun to express our frustration and said, either you give us a solution or we will close the monastery. But we never truly intended to close it. We didn't want to cause disruption or jeopardize the entire effort of international tourism, nor do we want to wrong the Egyptians. He keeps going on to say that even though the great and eminent Mr. Sisi was eager for the agreement, recognizing and protecting the monastery to be signed, in the end they dismissed it, citing absurd arguments. And even while the president of Egypt and the prime minister of Greece signed the agreement, someone else from Egypt was telling me completely different things. So obviously this is becoming a big diplomatic deal between the Egyptians and the Greeks. Archbishop Damien of the Church of Sinai, he of course is an interesting, his office is an interesting thing in and of itself. He's part of the Church of Sinai, which is an autonomous part, some would say, of the Jerusalem Patriarchate, but others would argue it is effectively autocephalous in and of itself because him as an archbishop, he has jurisdiction over the monastery and a few of its holdings on the Sinai Peninsula. And despite the fact that the Archbishop of Sinai is always consecrated by the Jerusalem Patriarchate, he himself is elected by the Brotherhood of the Monastery. So again, obviously you have to have bishops to consecrate another bishop. So the question is, does that make the Jerusalem Patriarchate sort of their mother church? They're just autonomous under, much like the church in Ukraine is to Moscow, or as would be evidenced by where the election of the archbishop comes from and, their territorial holdings, and the fact that they're definitely not part of the Patriarchate of Alexandria, who is supposedly the patriarch of all Africa. There's an argument to be made that they have a sort of autocephaly that, perhaps could only be compared to Mount Athos, who it could even be, greater than Mount Athos, because Mount Athos is, it's granted a form of lateral movement and autonomy, but, on things like the calendar, but ultimately is still under the ecumenical patriarchate. So very interesting situation at St. Catherine's. Be sure to keep the monks there in your prayers. I think some of the imminent nature of the expulsion was somewhat exaggerated, but is actually real. It wasn't fake news. And according to Archbishop Damien, it's clear that they are under imminent threat and constant persecution from the local authorities. So continue to pray for this monastery. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Dimitri, and if you have any other closing thoughts on World War III and also church persecution news.
Yeah, very unfortunate news coming out of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, especially given what's taking place in the Holy Land as well. I almost do not think that this is accidental, all this pressure on Orthodox Christians in this particular part of the world. And this really does show you, Conrad, that if the US, which essentially funds and provides all this free donation to Egypt, if it actually cared about the rights of Christians in the Middle East, they would again intervene here and apply enough pressure. It wouldn't even take much for Trump or J.D. Vance or anyone, or even Marco Rubio, to commit to stopping this nonsense from taking place in St. Catherine's Monastery. But alas, I think we see who really the State Department and the US government actually cares for, and it's certainly not Orthodox Christians in the Middle East. And just in relationship to the persecution of Christians in Ukraine, I think there's been some good and some very curious warnings and threats, some good developments there. First, we discussed the meeting of all the Ukrainian bishops, or at least the majority of them, at Theophania, which is one of the outskirts, a monastery located on the outskirts of Kiev in its southwestern location. It's a very beautiful parkland, and all the bishops met up there. And we were expecting, we were all keeping bishops in our prayers for them not to make the wrong decision, because apparently there were threats of an announcement of autocephaly by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, that is the canonical church. Fortunately enough, that wasn't done. Simply, what was committed was a condemnation of the special military operation, chastisement of, say, Patriarch Kirill, lightly, President Putin, essentially stating that, well, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church continues to support the armed forces of Ukraine and the Ukrainian citizens generally speaking, and they condemn all violence and warfare, and no announcement of autocephaly. Now, people are speculating that because apparently Metropolitan Theodosy of Cherkasy, one of our favorite bishops, confessor of the faith, he managed to have his lawyers attend the hearing, and he traveled to this council. He participated there alongside another very good bishop. This is one of the members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Synod. He's the head of the administration of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, essentially Metropolitan Onufriy's right-hand man. Fortunately, very pro-Russian, very conservative Metropolitan Anthony Pakanich. He's actually personally facing sanctions and pressure, but he's not technically in that, he's not in that sphere of confessorship yet, as many other Ukrainian hierarchs are. But Anthony Pakanich apparently spoke out very strongly in support of the canonicity of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, that announcing autocephaly would disconnect all of the Ukrainian Orthodox Christians under their leadership of these bishops from essentially this communion of orthodoxy. They cannot announce autocephaly, and Metropolitan Anthony and Metropolitan Theodosy apparently stopped any pushes by any, say, left-wing pro-Zelensky bishops at this council from moving any of these proposals forward. But the real fear is that this week, in fact, it has already commenced, the deadline, as of the first week of June, the deadline for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to completely distance itself from the Moscow Patriarchate and the so-called Russian world has been met. So now the Ukrainian state has complete authority to close down any parish, monastery, or cathedral that is in some way related to Russia. Again, the way the the legislation in Ukraine was worded, it's very vague. Does this mean that the feast days for Orthodox Christian saints from a Russian background, Russian heritage, from Russia proper itself, Russian icons, are they under threat? Can you venerate Russian saints such as Seraphim of Sarov or Tsar Nicholas II and his family? All these questions, I think, are purposefully left in the grey in order to allow for Ukrainian SBU and police officers to raid churches at will. And evidence of that is given by one of Zelensky's top advisors, a deputy of the Verkhovnaya Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, Nikita Potorayev. Again, according to his Wikipedia, we understand what kind of ethnic background he comes from. He's apparently an ethnic Ukrainian. But if we look at a physiognomy, if we look at the fact that he was born in Dnipropetrovsk, which is, again, if you look at maps of the New Heavenly Jerusalem, the capital of New Khazaria, he's exactly from there. And as are many other people like Kolomoisky, Zelensky himself, and even the head of the Dnipro Defense Council, Gennady Korban. Now, Gennady Korban is even more of a devious character. One of Kolomoisky's top henchmen. He looks like an evil Jewish version of Javier Bardem, basically, like a very ugly version. And these sort of people are the ones who are pushing for the persecution of the Orthodox Church. Nikita Potorayev, in particular, if you look at all of his previous statements throughout the last 2 years, he was the one, in fact, I think, who was whispering into Zelensky's ear that he should be increasing and pushing for the persecution of the Moscow-led Ukrainian church under Metropolitan Onufry. So this guy spoke out recently and said that, look, we start closing down churches related to Moscow, these people are going to start worshipping in homes. So we're going to need to raid people's homes. The SBU will need to search homes, search for these home churches. Essentially, he's announcing a war on the non-existent catacomb church of the Ukrainian Orthodox Christians ahead of time. Mind you, these people know church history sometimes better than we Orthodox Christians do, so they know exactly what will happen when the official church goes on the ground. And they're already preparing for it. These are not trivial statements which he was making. So very fortunately, Metropolitan Onufry and the Synod and all the other bishops participating, they chose the correct decision of not separating themselves through breach of communion with Moscow. And despite the fact that they don't commemorate Patriarch Kirill anymore, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church remains a completely canonical and correct body, the only canonical church on the territory of Ukraine. And that's, I think, a huge blessing. I think all the prayers that, of course, our listeners gave and all the other people, and I think the Holy Spirit really did act at this council, and the correct decision was made. Unfortunately, persecution news in relation to a church being taken. As we mentioned on our 8th hour episode, churches have literally been taken over legally and through protests almost on a weekly basis across all of Ukraine. It's hard to cover all the stories. Typically, these raids, they take place at night, but this time in the city of Chernigov, and notice the hubris of these people. Chernigov is located in this triangle where Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine meet, right? The meeting point, it's literally, I think, 30 or 40 kilometers away from the border of Belarus. So literally, you can, with binoculars, look across the border at Chernigov. Ukrainians, in particular, the members of the OCU, the Epiphany Sergei Dumenko Church, raided a church in broad daylight. I think it was yesterday, just maybe even on the feast day of Ascension. They just waltzed into the church, started taking things, icons, etc., started kicking out all the parishioners, the priests, deacons, and the police showed up, the Ukrainian police of the city of Chernigov showed up and the police did nothing. I mean, they stood by just watching. And this raid occurred in broad daylight, but right next to the Belarusian and Russian borders. And, we just have to ask the question, would it really be that bad if Belarusian and Russian troops crossed the border and, say, captured the Ukrainian city of Chernigov and liberated all the Orthodox Christians? Footage like this, such egregious acts against the faithful, I mean, they kind of lean me in a certain direction, that's for sure. And, just ending it on a more positive note, there was a really big celebration on the 25th of May. This was the celebration of the baptism of Prince Vladimir of Kiev. Of course, Vladimir, equal to the apostles, the one who baptized all of Rus in 988 AD. But his personal baptism took place in the city of Khersones, and Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov, who we, of course, love and adore, and hopefully he'll be the next patriarch of Moscow and all of Rus. I think he'll be the perfect candidate. In fact, we soon, hopefully, will be releasing a very interesting documentary made by him, translated and subtitled by some of their friends. So look out for that. one of our best releases, I think, on the Substack. So definitely subscribe, support us, because the content will be amazing that we'll be bringing to you. But Metropolitan Tikhon led a huge church procession, thousands of people of Crimea, Orthodox Russians, Ukrainians, different people from all around the world, onlookers, and of course they celebrated liturgy at the St. Vladimir Cathedral in Khersones. And by the way, the St. Vladimir Cathedral, very old cathedral, during the Ukrainian years of Crimea, there was barely any liturgies that were allowed there. The Ukrainian Culture Department and the State Department of Ukraine would all the time cancel liturgies, cancel worship, because they just said, well, it's a museum. You can't conduct a liturgy here. You can't invite all these hundreds of people. So apparently, according to Jan Taksur and some of the other journalists covering Orthodoxy in Ukraine, prior to the SMO, prior to even the so-called annexation of Crimea, it was hard to even have a liturgy take place at this cathedral. And now it's full of thousands of people. It's so big that there's thousands were standing outside. So it was a great sight, amazing photographs from that 25th of May celebration. And last news as well, as the persecution ramps up, there are threats that the last of the monks who are currently living in this commune type area, essentially these apartments adjacent to the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, there's about between 170 and 194 monks located there. These are Ukrainian Orthodox monks living near the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra who aren't allowed to work on the monastery grounds anymore. So they've just been living in these apartments, essentially. Allegedly, the Ukrainian government is planning to kick them out soon because, again, these monks are hardliners. They're obviously pro-Russian. Most of them, they haven't essentially come to terms with the fact that the greatest monastery in Ukraine has been captured by the state. And the Ukrainian government will be forcing all of these almost 200 people, 200 monastics out, and they will be essentially homeless. So hopefully pious Orthodox Christians around Kiev and other places will give them a home temporarily. Maybe they'll be moved to another monastery. So very tough situation. We'll need to keep all these persecuted people just from the Sinai to Palestine to Ukraine in our prayers, because there's definitely a lot of pressure on these various local Orthodox churches taking place, which I think we cover in great detail here on the show.
No, I completely agree. In the Kiev Caves Lavra itself, there was a recent dismissal of the head of the state-operated Kiev Caves Museum. He was said to be too soft in the battle against the church and its ongoing presence in the holy monastery. So many MPs, members of parliament in Ukraine, are talking about how Lavrov is trying to signal to the U.S. to pressure Ukraine to protect what he calls the ROC church, but ultimately he thinks that's in vain, and all these people seem dead set on persecuting the canonical church. So be sure to listen to our Ether Hour episode with Father John, because Father John really hammers home the point that fundamentally these people are motivated by a demonic spirit to persecute the Church of Christ. And that's really the only thing that can explain the level to which they're pursuing this, especially considering how much Metropolitan Onufry and other bishops of the church have supported the Ukrainian war effort and the preservation of it as a state, from my perspective at least, no matter how phony the Ukrainian state really is. And you think about, Lavrov's comments about protecting the Orthodox people of Ukraine, you're wondering, you hope that this is perhaps part of the reason, this is maybe the only justification I could think for some of the stalled and, not really rapidly advancing front line in the operations, especially in the Donbass, is, for example, what would happen to Bishop Arseny, Metropolitan Arseny, who's currently, languishing in a Ukrainian prison, I believe in Dnipro. What would happen if his monastery and the brothers under his care fall completely under Russian territory? Because the front line isn't far from Svyatogorsk Monastery, but, if they did take that territory, what would happen to him? Would they use him as a hostage? Would he be a bargaining chip? So hopefully, in my perspective, the Russians should be planning, rescue operations for any of these imprisoned hierarchs and priests. But, I'm not going to get so ahead of myself and, wish casting so much to think that that's actually something being discussed right now at the Russian Ministry of Defense. But, we can hope. But yeah, like you said, it's unfortunate that even with people like J.D. Vance and others who have openly discussed the persecution, with people like Tucker Carlson, one of the biggest podcasters in the game right now, openly, waving the banner for the cause of the UOC, it's clear that, unfortunately, with the help of the ecumenical patriarch, in my opinion, and Mike Pompeo, they successfully muddied the waters enough to where Protestants start to think about it enough, they just don't really understand it, to where they kind of check out and aren't able to adequately defend the truth. And people like Trump's his favorite pastor, Pastor Mark Burns, this black brother, he goes off all the time about how the OCU is the correct church and that the UOC is incorrect and there's no persecution. So with idiots like that in your ear, maybe that's why Trump isn't, listening to JD Vance, who's much more plugged into, people on the ground and people that actually understand what's going on, like, the Union of Orthodox Journalists and other people that we consider friends of the show. But final piece of church news here before we wrap things up. I know it's been a longer show here. Metropolitan Tychikos, of course, we discussed how he was unfortunately removed from the Paphos Cathedra uncanonically. This is a recent article from the Union of Orthodox Journalists, who I just mentioned before. Dr. Elpidophoros Soteropoulos, who is a doctor of theology in the Greek Orthodox Church, he called the vote against Metropolitan Tychikos a violation of the church canons. This is from Cyprus. I believe, actually, Dr. Elpidophoros is a member of the church in Cyprus. He described the event as both a church schism and a violation of canonical law. According to the theologian, his initial reaction to the news was one of indescribable bitterness and sadness. Soteropoulos drew a symbolic parallel, saying he saw 6 Orthodox hierarchs voting for Metropolitan Tychikos of Paphos and 10 cardinals voting against, which, I'm sure you can see what he's doing there. Criticizing the decision-making process, the expert pointed out a blatant breach of the Church of Cyprus's statutes to impose a disciplinary sanction on a bishop. A 3/4 majority of synod hierarchs is required, at least 12 votes, but the decision was made with only 10 votes, and they later declared it a trial to justify what is, in fact, unjustifiable, he stressed. Soteropoulos drew a direct parallel with the events of the gospel. The entire scene reminded me of Christ's trial by the high priests and Pharisees, which was unjust because the legal principles of the time were violated. They did the same here, breaking not only divine law, but human law as well. The theologian offered high praise for the deposed hierarch's character and ministry. While he noted that he had no special relationship with Metropolitan Tychikos, he said he had heard very good things from many people about the bishop. In Soteropoulos' view, the real cause of the conflict lies in Metropolitan Tychikos' principled stance on ecumenical issues. There are increasing signs that this was part of a coordinated campaign against the Metropolitan of Paphos. The Archbishop of Cyprus clearly cannot accept that Metropolitan Tychikos steadfastly refuses to allow representatives of heterodox confessions into his diocese, despite the Archbishop's efforts to promote dialogue with them. He's, of course, referencing the fact that Metropolitan Tychikos didn't want representatives of the Vatican to bring relics of saints to Paphos and to Cyprus that he said would inevitably lead to concelebration. Dr. Elpidophoros, he called Metropolitan Tychikos a diamond shining in the firmament of the church, guiding the faithful, and emphasized that no matter what they do, they cannot use darkness to extinguish the light because darkness has no substance. He goes on to talk about how Archbishop Georgios has an inexplicable aggression towards Metropolitan Tychikos, which there was much reporting on how angry Archbishop Georgios was against Metropolitan Tychikos when he refused to concelebrate with him over the Ukrainian schismatic issue. And ever since then, I think he's been, deeply enraged on that. And going on, despite his sharp criticism, the theologian called on the faithful to respond peacefully yet firmly. I believe there must be a well-organized nationwide unifying protest at the archbishopric so that people can reaffirm their faith in the Orthodox tradition, he said. At the same time, Soteropoulos stressed the need to follow Christ's example. We are obliged to follow the example of the Lord, who remained silent before his accusers. We possess the most powerful weapons, humility and prayer. So I think I agree with that. I believe if you're in Cyprus, I would recommend, organizing with your local priests, perhaps get in contact with Metropolitan Neophytos and his, people in his orbit and see what they're calling on people to do. And if there is mobilization and there are peaceful protests, where people can carry banners and, call for, the statutes of the rules of the Church of Cyprus to be accurately followed for Metropolitan Tychikos to be restored, I would definitely support that. I would even consider flying out for something like that if it was well organized and I knew I would be able to make a difference. But regardless, I think people should do that. People should organize peacefully within the bounds, of course, of the laws of the Republic of Cyprus, which I respect and honor. And everyone, I think, though, should make their voices heard if you are a traditional Orthodox Christian. I know that Metropolitan Neophytos and Metropolitan Athanasios of Limassol, for example, voted in favor of Metropolitan Tychikos, but I heard, unfortunately, the Metropolitan Nikiforos of Kikos, of all people, who literally wrote the book on the ecumenical patriarch's overreach in the Ukraine crisis. Apparently, he voted against Metropolitan Tychikos, which is very unfortunate. And of course, this comes amidst the news that it was a personal letter from ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew that Archbishop Georgios should pursue this witch hunt against Metropolitan Tychikos, which clearly came with the demand that, your rules be damned. The ecumenical patriarch is the first without equals, so screw the Church of Cyprus, screw the fact that you have autocephaly granted to you at the Second Ecumenical Council. I'm your real bishop, and you're going to do what I want, and that's clearly exactly what happened. So it would be amazing if Russia and Antioch and other churches would call this out as well, but I'm not holding my breath. But I will say this, hopefully, maybe in the next 2 weeks, I don't know when it will be coming out, but I am writing what effectively will be somewhat breaking news. I've hinted at it multiple times on the show, but when I was in Cyprus, we were effectively stalked by agents, what I would consider of the deep church, that I think are responsible for the persecution of Metropolitan Tychicos. And I will be writing all about that, explaining what happened and how I think with the timing, it ties very much into this persecution, and how it wouldn't surprise me if at this quote unquote trial, some of this was mentioned. So I'm going to be writing about that. Stay tuned. worldwarnow.co. Be sure to subscribe. Not trying to use this crisis for growth or clicks, but I think this is relevant and important stuff. And it hits very close to home because I love Metropolitan Tychicos. So I hope this can get resolved. But stay tuned. I'm going to be reporting on that. And again, be sure to listen to our episode with Father John recently that touches on a lot of these issues and things adjacent to them. But with all that being said, before I do the plugs and send us all off, Dimitri, do you have any final thoughts this week for the audience?
No, Conrad, thank you for that very accurate and detailed coverage of the Cyprus issue. I think we may be the only podcast actually on the internet in the English language that actually covers these particular events. And many of us, may be questioning as to why should we not care about such a hierarch being persecuted? Because look, if you could go back in time and support Saint Nectarius of Egina, would you? Absolutely. And in this case, we have an opportunity to literally do that. We have a bishop who is essentially becoming a confessor before our very own eyes. And at the very least, we should be speaking about him, writing about him, and essentially bringing light to the injustice taking place there in one of those most ancient Orthodox Christian islands in the world. So it's good that we're covering this, Conrad. And our episodes recently, especially the one with Father John Whiteford recently released, are great companions to these World War Now episodes. So if you haven't yet subscribed, definitely worth doing that. Even trying out, try the trial free subscription on Substack, listen to the episodes, maybe they'll be to your liking. And again, we appreciate all of your support in the algorithms. I see people are liking the episodes, sharing them, promoting the episode against the algorithmic system, which I think fundamentally goes against a lot of the content that we're trying to promote here. And I think that's somewhat targeted. So thank you all for your support and listening.
No, I couldn't have said it better myself, Dimitri, and thank you all who make it to the very end of these episodes. Be sure to get behind that paywall and support us. Just $7 a month, you get access to all hundreds and hundreds of hours of Ether Hour content, over 80 numbered episodes at this point. So a lot of content to binge, because most of it, I believe, is timeless. It's not as, time sensitive, relevant to the news cycle as these weekly World War Now shows that we, of course, bring you for free on a weekly basis. But of course, those behind the paywall and those, paying us those $7 a month at worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. Those are the ones that make it possible for us to do these free shows every week for everyone. So thank you again to everybody that's already doing that. And again, huge show this week with Father John Whiteford. Get behind the paywall to hear the full analysis. We talk about Sister Vasa, everything that went on with her and how she is now a member of the Schismatics in Ukraine. We talk about Israel, Palestine. We talk about the recent BBC hit pieces and podcast about yours truly, as well as Father John himself, Father Moses, and some other people. They're really coming after Orthodoxy in Texas, which, makes sense because it's growing so rapidly. So keep that whole situation in your prayers. Be sure to follow us again on Substack, worldwarnow.co. That's our home base. I will be returning to live streaming this coming Tuesday. I don't know when this episode will be released, hopefully before the Tuesday, but I will be streaming 7:45 p.m. Central Time on the World War Now YouTube channel and X account. So subscribe to us on that, World War Now on YouTube. Be sure to follow us on X at World War Now _. Follow me on X at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at WWN Host. Be sure to follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. Click the links down below to follow us on Discord. Get in the Discord channel. We're in there all the time talking, sharing memes, sharing news, talking about breaking news, talking about Orthodox news. So be sure to get on there if you want to ask us a question or something. We do have a Q&A episode upcoming as well. So get behind the paywall to ask us a question that will be answered in full in a future Ether Hour episode. So again, thank you all so much for listening here to the end. Thank you to all paid supporters. You are the ones that keep this thing going. And with all of that, we will see you on the next one. God bless.